Chapter 749. In the fog-shrouded cave in Shangjing West Mountain, Fan Xian had once told Xiao En, who was dying, that he was actually just a tourist walking in this world. He wanted to see more scenery, so he had a strong interest in the temple. Unlike the Northern Qi Emperor who wanted to use the power of the temple to unify the world, the former Wei Emperor who wanted to obtain the secret of immortality from the temple, and the Qing Emperor who used the temple as a fighter with unusual valiance, Fan Xian's interest in the temple in the past was mainly in the unknowns. Fan Xian's strong desire for the temple's secrets inevitably had more practical considerations attached to it. He needed to enter the temple and find traces of Uncle Wu Zhu to confirm his safety. He also needed to try to find a way to return to the world and defeat the Qing Emperor. These were actually only two sides of the same thing. As long as Uncle Wu Zhu was still alive, then everything would be easy to handle. In Fan Xian's understanding, there was no one in this world who could harm Uncle Wu Zhu and leave him behind. The black-shrouded young Grandmaster possessed overly powerful and wondrous skills. Even if the great Grandmasters who had once existed in the world worked together, Wu Zhu would probably have enough ways to escape. The problem was, this snowy mountain was the temple, that illusory fairyland that had always stood above the clouds of human society's legends. For such a place that did not belong to the secular world, even Wu Zhu was probably not a match for it. Reality seemed to prove this point. Uncle Wu Zhu had returned to the temple to search for his roots. A few years had already passed, yet there had been no news. If he had not been imprisoned in the temple, then he had probably already left this world. The morning sun did not have a glimmer of warmth. It shone coldly on the three people at the foot of the snowy mountain. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and raised his head to look at the majestic snowy mountain in front of him that seemed to cover half the sky. He watched the ice and snow reflect a jade-like glow under the morning light. He was silent for a long time and didn't speak. The three top young people in the world had set out from the camp when the sky was still dark. After walking for a few hours, they approached the snowy mountain with great difficulty. What shocked Haitang and 13th Wang was that Fan Xian seemed to be very familiar with the path under the snowy mountain. He led the two of them easily through a narrow passageway under the snowy mountain and came directly to the other side. This side of the great snowy mountain was also a plain made of ice. There was nothing but snow and ice. The three of them had passed through the snowy mountain and arrived on the other side. Their camp was on the other side of the snowy mountain. "Where is the temple?" 13th Wang asked between breaths, carrying Sigujian's urn of ashes on his back. His face, which was wrapped in cloth clothing, was frozen red. Fan Xian was supported by Haitang. He narrowed his eyes and looked up the mountain. Back then, Xiao En and Master Ku, he went up from this side of the mountain. Logically speaking, the temple should be right in front of us. However, there was nothing in front of them. There was only jade-like ice and snow covering the mountain range of an unknown color. At this moment, the wind was not strong. The sky had not sent down a snowstorm. Their field of view was vast and clear. In this clear field of view, it was impossible to find any signs of man-made carvings. Haitang, who was supporting him, was silent for a moment. She then suddenly said, "In the old legends, the temple only appears in front of common people for 1 or 2 days a year. If the temple does not want to be seen by mortals, then no matter how hard mortals search, they will not be able to find it. Legends are, after all, just legends." Fan Xian covered his mouth and coughed. The clothes he wore were very thick and could barely withstand the cold of the outside world. Speaking of which, it was rather miraculous. Presently, the temple was close at hand. Although he didn't know its location, the dense yuanqi between heaven and earth had begun to flow faster into his body, making his injuries and illness much better. With great difficulty, the coughing stopped. Fan Xian blinked his eyes and looked tiredly at the messy snow and rocks on the snowy mountain. The legends may not be true, Back then, your teacher and Sir Shao En endured a few months under this snowy mountain just to wait 1 or 2 days for the temple to appear. I don't know how much human flesh they ate. I don't want to wait. Fan Xian had experienced 2 lives that other people could not have, so he absolutely believed that there was the will of heaven in the unseen world. However, the education he had received in his previous life made it impossible for him to shake off his atheism. Thus, this contradiction made him feel a faint reverence toward the temple. On the other hand, he didn't really believe in the so-called legends. If the legends are not true, then there must be a trick to the temple being hidden in this snowy mountain. Haitang Duodwa's entire face was covered by her fur collar. In a droning voice she said, "If we want to search through this mountain, given our present state, it will probably take a lot of time. I also understand. Since it will take a lot of time, then let's quickly begin," Fan Xian said in a raspy voice. He then glanced at 13th Wang. "Presumably, you have also noticed that the nights here are particularly short. After a few more days, there will probably be no night. It will be more convenient for us to search." After many months of arduous travel on the snowy plains, Fan Xian no longer purposely hid the knowledge he knew from his previous life in front of Haitang and 13th Wang. Each of his predictions eventually became reality. However, Haitang and 13th Wang did not know the basis of his predictions. In their hearts, Fan Xian appeared more and more mysterious and unfathomable. During these months, Haitang and 13th Wang did not have a sliver of doubt or hesitation toward any of Fan Xian's predictions or orders. However, at this moment, the 3 of them stood in front of the snowy mountain and were about to begin their search for the temple. 13th Wang did not head toward the snowy mountain. Instead, he glanced at Haitang. Coincidentally, Haitang also glanced at 13th Wang. Their gazes met. They both saw the worry and shock in each other's eyes. Fan Xian noticed the strangeness of his 2 friends. Furrowing his brows slightly, he coughed and said, "What is it?" 13th Wang was silent for a moment. He then looked at him and said, "We are just curious. The temple is right in front of us. Based on your predictions, no matter how long it takes, we will always be able to find the temple before the night comes." Fan Xian nodded. He didn't understand the meaning of his words. His brows furrowed even deeper. Beside him, Haitang sighed and said, "What we mean is that we are about to find the temple. Regardless of whether it is to dig out the secret of the temple or to rescue the blind Great Master from the temple, you have to have a plan ahead of time and make some preparations. If you have any understanding, you have to let us know ahead of time. Given your present physical condition, there are many things that require us to do." The temple was like a fairyland. At least, it was so in the hearts of the people of this land. Fan Xian and the other 2 were exploring the temple. This was a major event, yet Fan Xian appeared relaxed and careless. It was even a bit sloppy. It was as if he was truly just traveling. Who knew what kind of dangers were hidden on this snowy mountain and what kind of divine might was difficult for mortals to withstand? Haitang and 13th Wang were both top figures with the most determined wills and willpower in the world. Faced with this snowy mountain, they still found it difficult to suppress a sense of confusion and fear. They truly did not understand how Fan Xian could still be so relaxed and at ease. Back then, Ku He and Shao En returned from the temple alive. This place is not as terrifying as people imagine. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. Back then, the 2 of them were already superior 9th-level aces. However, they were tortured for half a year and were about to die. Their strength is not as good as we are now. Since they can return alive, what are we afraid of? Furthermore, Uncle Wu Zhu and the Emperor have both said that the temple has already fallen into ruin and has no power. Fan Xian lowered his eyelids slightly. "I believe in the Emperor's judgment because he has basically never made any mistakes in this life. Even though the temple had fallen into ruin, it was still a temple. Could mortals stop worshipping it? More importantly, I only know the way to the temple and its outer appearance. As for what is inside, I don't know either, Fan Xian said with a helpless smile. Since it is so, then it is useless to make any more preparations. Let's search. We'll talk about it after we find it. This was a very irresponsible way of doing things. Fan Xian had spent his entire life immersed in the darkness of the Overwatch Council. He never fought a battle unprepared. Even when faced with the unfathomable Emperor, he still came up with clever plans and bravely thought of little ways to win. Looking at this snowy mountain that he knew nothing about, how could he have prepared? The snowy mountain remained silent, solemn, and cold. It was as if it had no idea that three mortals were nervously and quietly searching for its secrets. The temple, which was rumored to be omnipotent and omniscient, was still like a girl waiting to be married, hidden in the wind and snow, unwilling to show its true face. After climbing up the snowy mountain with great difficulty for a long time, the wind on the mountain gradually grew stronger. It swirled up the snow on the rocks, blinding the eyes. Fan Xian's eyes remained clear and steady. He did not let go of any details that could have been missed. In his calculations, the temple only appeared for 1 or 2 days a year. The last time Xiao En and Ku he had seen the temple was the day after the polar night ended. There had to be some pattern hidden here. Only after the polar night did the sunlight fall on this snowy mountain. Did the people in the temple want to sunbathe, so they appeared? Leaning against Haitong's warm back, Fan Xian turned his head in satisfaction and sniffed the girl's neck. He was incomparably happy. He knew that his deduction was certainly correct. In the direction of the snowy mountain facing the sky, there would certainly be some man-made traces of ice and snow being broken. Haitong's brows furrowed slightly. She didn't understand where Fan Xian's confidence came from. She also didn't know why he was so happy. Reality was as Fan Xian expected. It didn't take long before 13th Wang, who was searching about 600 meters to the right, suddenly turned his head and made a hand gesture toward the two of them. In the wind and snow, it was difficult to hear clearly what 13th Wang had found. Fan Xian and Haitang could easily sense the excitement of the Sword Hut disciple. In a snowy depression, Fan Xian crouched down and carefully examined the traces 13th Wang had found. He pulled out a hole in the ice and snow and found what they had been looking for a long time, some man-made traces. It was something like a track. It was made of an unknown material. Even in such a harsh and cold environment, it was still incomparably smooth and did not deform at all. Fan Xian stood with Haitong's support and followed the track into the depths of the ice and snow until it reached the top. The wind and snow were strong. The majestic mountain range of ice and snow seemed to have suddenly snapped in the middle and sunk in. That was probably the end of the track. 13th Wang found a few other tracks beside this one. They were all made of a very high-quality material. No one knew what they were used for. The three of them immediately became nervous. There could only be one explanation for the sudden appearance of these magical tracks in this bitterly cold place that mortals would find difficult to reach. "Climb up along it," Fan Xian said in a raspy voice. Fan Xian spoke in a raspy voice. His voice trembled slightly, but his eyes were a calm that he barely managed to maintain with a valiant will. There were no paths on the snowy mountain. There was snow and wind everywhere. If one was the slightest bit careless, they would fall off the mountain and end up with their bones crushed. Fortunately, Fan Xian had brought Haitang and 13th Wang, two powerful warriors, here. Otherwise, how could a sick person like him endure the power of heaven and earth? The three of them suppressed their nervousness and faint fear and followed the smooth track. Going against the wind and snow, they climbed up the mountain range. After climbing for an indeterminable amount of time, when 13th Wang and Haitang both felt that the zhenqi in their bodies was about to be completely used up by the icy and snowy tracks, they suddenly felt their vision darken. The mountain was barren and the snow had no path. The sky darkened and the earth opened up. Fan Xian and the other two stared in a daze at the stone steps at the end of the track. They were speechless for a long time. This place was truly a work of nature. Such long stone steps were hidden on a platform deep in the mountain range. If someone could actually come to the snowy mountain, they would not be able to see these stone steps from the foot of the mountain. The temple appeared for 1 or 2 days every year. Did it mean that these stone steps would slide out along the track and bathe in the sunlight to welcome travelers who came with great difficulty to worship? These stone steps were made of green stone. No one knew how many thousands or tens of thousands of years they had experienced the baptism of ice and frost. There were many damaged areas. Amidst the ancientness, there was an ancient and frightening beauty. Different from the tracks, only when they saw these seemingly endless stone steps did the 3 of them truly feel like they were entering the temple. As they slowly walked up the stone steps, an indescribable atmosphere shrouded the 3 of them and shrouded the stone steps. The 3 of them maintained their silence at the same time. No matter who it was, in the moment before the mysterious veil of the temple was lifted, they would probably find it difficult to hide their excitement and fear. This was a kind of excitement and fear toward the unknown. It was human instinct. A long, light gray eve appeared above the stone steps and reflected itself in their eyes. Haitang and 13th Wang's bodies froze slightly and paused. Fan Xian broke away from Haitang's support and stared at the gray eve calmly, almost crazily, as he walked toward the top of the stone steps. Under the long, light gray eve was a black stone wall. Just like this, as the 3 of them walked, it slowly revealed its true appearance. A solemn feeling followed the temple as it emerged from the world of ice and snow and enveloped the entire world. The temple finally appeared in front of the 3 of them. It appeared so calmly and naturally that it made the 3 of them feel a trace of disbelief. They had searched for it for thousands of miles in the crowd, dreamed of it, suspected that they had entered a dream. The temple that tens of thousands of people had searched up and down for thousands of years had actually appeared just like that. They could not help but feel a strange emotion. Standing at the top of the last stone step, Fan Xian's hands outside his leather jacket trembled slightly. He looked woodenly at the temple in front of him and was unable to speak for a long time. Beside him, Haitang and 13th Wang found it even harder to suppress the emotions in their hearts. With perplexed expressions, they looked at the magnificent building. The temple was very large. At least, it was impossible to build such a grand temple with the construction skills of the human world. The tall black stone walls were like unmelting black ice that stretched in front of the 3 of them. The long, light gray eaves extended all the way to the end of the platform above the stone step. No one knew how many secrets of history and heaven and earth surrounded it. To be able to build such a grand temple, the platform at the end of the stone steps, hidden deep in the snowy mountains, was extraordinarily large. It was many times larger than the square in front of the Qing royal palace, which could hold tens of thousands of people. The thing that gave the 3 of them the most direct sense of pressure and grandeur was the front door of the temple in front of them. This door was at least 27 feet tall and immeasurably deep. Its color was a simple and unadorned dark color. The 3 of them stood on the stone step. They were still dozens of feet away from the front door of the temple. Because the front door was too tall and large, it made them feel as if it was right in front of their eyes. The pressure it gave off was very powerful. It wanted to make one fall to the ground and worship endlessly. Standing on the platform in front of the temple, Fan Xian, Haitang, and 13th Wang were all the most extraordinary young people in the world. However, in this grand square in front of the temple, they were like 3 lost ants in the grass. Suddenly raising their heads and finding a large tree blocking the sun, they were shocked speechless. The only person who could maintain his calm was probably Fan Xian. After all, he had seen Jin Mao and the 3 Gorges Dam in his previous life. He knew that the temple in front of him was certainly a miracle in the eyes of the people of this world. In his eyes, it was nothing more than a pretty building. It was difficult for one to see the ocean as water. It was difficult for one to see Mount Wu as clouds. In the past, Fan Xian could not explain these words to Zhuang Mohan and Sirhan. Presently, in front of the temple, Fan Xian found a new explanation. One's horizons and experience determined the height one stood at. Because he had experienced it, it was difficult to be intimidated. Fan Xian was not more outstanding than Haitang and 13th Wang. It was precisely because he had experienced a more developed civilization in his previous life that he appeared much calmer. Even so, with the temple in front of him, it was still difficult for him to suppress his nervousness. He stared fixedly at the doors of the temple in front of him and was silent for a long time. In an instant, he lowered his head and looked at the green stone steps under his feet. He thought of decades ago, when Master Ku He, whose body was already extremely broken, had used his palms to slap the stone steps under his feet and cried bitterly. Now, the three of them could be considered much calmer. After calming his emotions, Fan Xian suddenly raised his head. His pupils constricted slightly as he stared at the large signboard above the doors of the temple. Just as Xiao An had said in the cave, because it had been too long, what was written on the signboard could no longer be seen clearly. There were only some incomplete symbols left. In Xiao An's narration, perhaps these symbols were the mysterious decree of heaven. In Fan Xian's eyes, these symbols that had finally appeared in front of him represented an even more shocking discovery. Fan Xian stared in a daze at the only remaining Wu on the signboard, as well as the three symbols below it. One up, one down, one up, one down, two circular arcs put together. It was the entire content of the symbol. He extended his finger into the cold air and unconsciously began to move along with the symbol. Ever since the 5th year of the Qin calendar, he didn't know how much effort he had put into this Wu and these three identical symbols. He had also asked Uncle Wu Zhu and Sigujian for guidance. After all, there was too little information, so he had come up with nothing. Now this Wu and these symbols had finally appeared in front of him. How could he not feel agitated? Fan Xian noticed the position of the incomplete Wu on the signboard, as well as the position of the three symbols. A bright light flashed through his mind like lightning. It made him completely stunned. His legs seemed to be out of his control as he walked in a daze toward the doors of the temple. Haitang and 13th Wang finally awoke from their shock at seeing the true appearance of the temple. They immediately noticed Fan Xian's abnormality and nervously followed him toward the doors of the temple. Fan Xian's gaze was still locked tightly onto the large signboard as he muttered to himself. He spoke faster and faster. It was impossible to tell that he was a patient. An excited flush rose to his face. What heavenly seal! If this isn't the letter M, what else could it be? Fan Xian's tired gaze had been completely replaced by a bright light of complicated emotions. He gritted his teeth and laughed foolishly. Looking at the large signboard, he finally understood what the temple was. He finally knew that the deduction he had never told anyone was correct. The tracks in the snowy mountain were not used to transport the stone steps to the sky beyond the mountain. Instead, they were used to transport the entire temple to the sky. The temple also needed energy. It needed sunlight. That was why it had appeared in front of the people after the polar night. It was this point that allowed Fan Xian to confirm that the temple was not a miracle. It was just a building whose exact use was still unknown. More importantly, he was finally sure that the ground he was standing on was still that blue planet. It was the Earth he had once mentioned to De Bao under the boundless starry sky. Fan Xian's lips were pale. Trembling, he said to himself, "If this is the Earth, then what is this temple? 3M's a thing. I didn't have such a large museum at the time." Endless emotions rushed into his mind, making him feel somewhat embarrassed. His cheeks were red, his lips were pale, and his eyes were somewhat lost. Yes, the temple was just a very, very old museum. The word Wu, that Xiao An remembered, was not a sickle or an axe. The 3M's were not heavenly seals, nor were they the marks of the Russian spaceships. They were just the most common letter in the English language. Yes, the large signboard of the temple clearly had the word thing, but the 3 M's below were the missing parts of the word. The temple was a museum. Fan Xian stood woodenly in front of the gate of the temple. Raising his head to look at the large signboard, he could not believe his eyes. If the world he was in was the Earth, then when was this museum, which clearly had a history of tens of thousands of years, built? Where were the people who built these museums? Why did such an existence exist in the world? Why did this museum become the temple that people spoke of? Thinking of the vague legends in human history, the Tianmai beings, the messengers of the temple, and the martial formulas and chests that had been stolen from the temple by his mother, Yi Qingmei, Fan Xian's body trembled uncontrollably. He felt as if he had found the greatest secret of this world, but he found that there were still too many questions that he could not explain clearly. Fan Xian coughed violently. In front of the dark gate of the temple, in front of the gate that looked like a book of history, he stooped down. An angry and helpless voice rang out from his chest. "What kind of King museum is this?" "This is a military museum." An emotionless voice rang out from the gate of the temple. It seemed to only want to answer Fan Xian's question, which was full of frustration and panic. Yes, the temple is a museum, and a military museum at that. When Xiao Yezi transmigrated, she could not have brought that chest with her. That chest has always been in the temple, but she stole it. I have always said that the cute Xiao Yezi is a thief. Comrade Fan Han, in the chapters of the Temple of Eternal Night, once wrote a book review. He guessed that the temple might be something, and that the symbols are the Soviet sickles and axes. Many other readers have made similar deductions, and they are all very powerful. However, from the beginning of this book, I set the temple as this because of my personal preference. I like interesting things, and that is why I am obsessed with the story. In this world, in this story, other than transmigrating, everything else needs a reason. Writing out the cause and effect is my love. Is the secret of the temple revealed just like that? No, how do I explain the secret manuals that created the great grandmasters? In the past, there was a mountain, and in the mountain, there was a temple. In the temple, there must be a person. The next chapter will slowly tell everyone about the origin and story of the temple. There is much more, and I have to write slowly. I have never tried to work during the new year. This year is the first time. I found that it is indeed not something a human should do, so I applied for leave. Now is the most important end of the Qing dynasty, so I will write slowly. I do not want to squeeze time to write to ensure that there are updates. That would be the worst. In the next few days I will still not update. I think everyone is used to my laziness, so I will not say too many apologies. I earnestly flattered everyone and did not disappoint them. I bowed deeply and left the stage. Chapter 750. The wind and snow stop. Hearing the calm voice, Fan Xian's pupils constricted. He looked warily at the heaven-like wooden door in front of him. He didn't know what kind of monster would run out from inside. After a long time, the temple in the depths of the snowy mountain remained silent. After the voice in the temple answered Fan Xian's unconscious angry question, it seemed to have sunk into some complicated thought process and sank into silence. Immediately after, the strangely large door in front of the temple silently opened a crack. When such a heavy door opened, it didn't make a single sound. It made one shiver even though it wasn't cold. The temple door opened at a 15-degree angle. From the front, one couldn't see the scenery inside. However, this silent opening seemed to indicate some kind of invitation from the person in the temple. Fan Xian's heart began to thump, and then he forced it to calm down. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the shadow of the temple door. There was not a trace of expression on his face. Unexpectedly, he slowly sat down on the shallow white snow on the stone platform. He had thought that it would be like decades ago. When Master Ku he was about to open the temple door, a black shadow would come out like lightning and give them a powerful blow. However, when the temple door opened, there was not a trace of movement. Could it be that the person in the temple also felt lonely and cold? Did the person in the temple hope to see them come? The mountain of treasures was in front, hell was in front, heaven was in front, and the scene of flowers and snow was in front. It was only a short distance away, yet Fan Xian sat down. A slightly bitter smile hung from the corners of his lips. He closed his eyes and began to meditate endlessly. Haitang and 13th Wang did not understand the conversation between the voice in the temple and Fan Xian. After all, there were no museums in this world. They also did not understand why Fan Xian would sit down in front of the temple door. They stared in a daze at the open door of the temple. Nervously, they walked to Fan Xian's side, took out the weapons at their side, and began to stand guard for him. Haitang's weapon was still the soft sword at her waist. 13th Wang had found a wooden stick from somewhere. Like a hunter, his eyes stared sharply at the temple door that had opened a crack. The three of them stood silently in front of the temple gate. The yuanqi in the surroundings was very thick. Fan Xian acutely sensed this, which was why he had closed his eyes and sat down. Before entering the temple, he had to at least ensure that he could move without hindrance. If he had to run wildly in a moment, he would at least not burden Haitang and 13th Wang. Since the temple was right in front of them and the temple doors were already open, they had waited for tens of thousands of years. Why was there a need to rush at this moment? After an indeterminable amount of time, Fan Xian slowly opened his eyes. The 36,000 pores on his body greedily absorbed enough yuanqi to repair a great deal of the wounds in his meridians. The zhenqi accumulated at the back of his waist could finally try to slowly flow. His spirit was much better and he was ready to enter the temple. Fan Xian's eyes landed on the door of the temple. 13th Wang was also staring nervously at it. With two crisp chirps, a little bird walked out childishly from the door of the temple and chirped at the three people outside. The bird's body was green and beautiful. It gave off a sense of purity. Outside the temple, the three people looked at the bird's arrival and couldn't help but start. They hadn't thought that the person coming to the temple to welcome guests would not be some demonic immortal general, but a bird. The green bird was attentively watching. "Let's go." Haitang looked at the beautiful green bird and her heart trembled slightly. She unconsciously said this and helped Fan Xian up from the snowy ground. Fan Xian's spirit was much better. He thought for a moment and then said, "Let's go in." One temple, one world. Behind the door was another world. However, what was different from what people imagined was that behind the gate of the temple was not a beautiful fairyland. It was also different from what Haitang imagined. That green bird flew away with a chirp, and there were no more cute creatures that came to welcome the hard-working traveler. Inside the temple was a square, a very large square. There were some large buildings scattered around the square. Although these buildings were tall, they were all blocked by the black stone wall outside. The people under the snowy mountain would not be able to see them. The materials and style of these buildings, as well as their height and breadth, were not at a level that the world people lived in could reach. On the walls on either side of the path, there were traces of extremely dilapidated murals. One could still faintly see a thread of lines and some very dim colors. Fan Xian and the other two walked along the path inside the temple. Raising their heads, they saw a snowy sky. Lowering their heads, they saw a snowy ground. They only felt that the world was still so quiet. The legendary scenes and scenery around them did not seem to exist in reality. The three of them were like three little black dots walking silently along the path. The voice in the temple did not ring out again. It was as if the people in the temple did not care where they came from and couldn't be bothered to guide them where they were going. Thus, Fan Xian and the other two only walked silently and casually along the path inside the temple. Their eyes calmly observed the eaves and large stone platforms of the buildings that passed by them. They appeared normal and casual, but waves of shock had long risen in their hearts. After all, this was the interior of the temple. No one in this world had probably ever entered. The land of legend and myth had finally appeared in front of them. What kind of complicated emotions were Haitang Duo and 13th Wang suppressing under their outward calmness? Back then, Ku He and Xiaoan had only been outside the temple's door when they met the Black Shadow and Little Fairy. Fan Xian and the other two had actually walked into the temple. Fan Xian had to be calmer. He had already faintly guessed the history of the temple from the voice in the temple's reply. His gaze stopped on the remnants of the wall paintings on the two sides of the path. The paint had peeled off badly. It was impossible to see clearly what was depicted on them. The secret of history seemed to be hidden in these paintings. However, Fan Xian easily found familiar traces in the remaining lines. Just like how the architectural style of the temple had influenced the dark green royal palace in Shangjing, the style of the wall paintings in the temple and the paintings in the Qin temple and even the restaurants in Yisher Tavern all seemed to come from the same source. It looked like the temple had stood in the world for thousands of years. Although it did not enter the world, it always had a faint influence on it. The wind and snow in the temple were much lighter than outside the walls. At this moment, the wind and snow had stopped long ago. There was only a thin layer of powdery snow on the path. Fan Xian and the other two's footprints were clearly imprinted on it, turning into a lonely line that went straight into the depths of the temple. Along the way, they only saw some broken buildings on the verge of collapse and a cold and uninhabited wasteland. This place was not a fairyland or the realm of the gods. Just as the Emperor and Uncle Wu Zhu had said, it was just a broken place. Fan Xian pulled back his gaze from the footprints in the snow and thought for a moment. He then continued to lead Haitang and 13th Wang forward. After entering the snowy plains, he had become the leader of the three of them. Although his injuries had not recovered and his illness had worsened, Haitang and 13th Wang faintly sensed that Fan Xian had more knowledge in certain areas than most people in the world. In front of them, the small, agile, and beautiful green bird was still chirping. Appearing and disappearing, it led the three young warriors who had come to worship the temple through the thin snow. Accompanied by loneliness and silence, they walked forward. They roughly confirmed the range of the buildings inside the temple. It was a flat square. Without realizing it, the three of them had already walked to the center of the temple. In the center of the temple was a platform. Behind the platform was the most well-preserved building. Although many scars from time could still be seen on the outside of the building, the gradually eroding stone edges bore witness to the ruthlessness of heaven and earth. In the end, this building had not collapsed. Walking all the way here, they did not see a single person or the legendary emissary of the temple. There was only the green bird flying and landing on the stone platform covered in thin snow. Fan Xian furrowed his brows slightly. He found that the green bird had landed on the thin snow but did not leave any footprint. The temple emissary did not appear. The silence of the voice confirmed another fact for him. Perhaps it was a mysterious reaction, but the three of them stopped in front of the stone platform. Looking at the green bird on the snowy platform, they were silent. It was as if they wanted to see it become a flower or bring back a flower with its mouth. After waiting for an indeterminable amount of time, the oppressive silence in the temple did not change at all. Fan Xian's movements also did not change at all. His body was slightly trembling, but his heart was trembling slightly. Along the way, the traces of the buildings they had passed actually made him nervous. He faintly felt that these buildings were the remains of a civilization left behind countless years ago. Perhaps there was some connection between them and the world in his previous life. There is no danger in the temple. Those emissaries of the temple should have all died. Fan Xian's raspy voice suddenly broke the silence that had been maintained for countless years inside the temple. The green bird on the platform turned its head and glanced at him. Fan Xian's sudden words startled Haitang and 13th Wang beside him. Ever since they had entered the temple, Haitang and 13th Wang's emotions had been shaken by the never-before-seen and never-before-heard enormous building remains and the little green bird that seemed to be able to communicate. They had long lost the calm judgment they had in the world and were perplexed. All dead. Haitang and 13th Wang had purely and unconsciously repeated Fan Xian's word. It was impossible for them to agree with his judgment. There was no danger in the temple? An illusory place that only existed in myths and legends had suddenly appeared in front of his eyes. Who could be like Fan Xian and forcefully say such a judgment? Haitang looked at the green bird on the platform. Her face was slightly pale. In a trembling voice, she said, "Even if it is a broken fairyland, it is still a fairyland. Heaven and man walk different paths. One must have a heart of respect." The naive children of Tianyi Dao worshipped the temple deeply in their bones. Among the disciples of Qing Mountain, no one had ever inherited Master Ku He's valiant spirit, including Haitang. When people faced the temple and entered it, they all unconsciously felt that they were much weaker. What is there to fear? Fan Xian did not say this out loud. He thought viciously in his heart. Uncle Wu Zhu had said that there were not many people left in the family. One had died in the alley outside the manor. When his mother died, one had also died in the temple. Seeing that he had entered this place safely and still no emissary from the temple had appeared, he could be sure that this rundown temple was just a wasteland. The temple was not a fairyland. It was just a ruin. After confirming this reality, Fan Xian no longer had any fear in his heart. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the green bird on the platform. Suddenly, he said, "It looks like the emissary is dead. The immortals in the temple have long left, leaving only this fairy bird. Let's stroll around. Let's go back." Haitang and 13th Wang turned their heads to look at Fan Xian in disbelief. Their emotions were unsettled. They did not hear Fan Xian's lie. Of course, this was also because of the faint disappointment and sorrow that could not be wiped away on Fan Xian's pale face. His acting was too brilliant. Blind. Haitang was going to say that if the temple was truly so barren and broken down, if there was truly no supreme existence beyond the 6 directions, why didn't they try to find Wu Zhu's whereabouts and instead return without any success? 13th Wang's muscles were tense. He didn't know how to face this spacious and desolate temple. After experiencing so many hardships, they had finally passed through the snowy plains to reach this place. How could he be willing to return? Fan Xian coughed hurriedly and stopped Haitang's question. He only stared fixedly at the green bird on the platform. Everything in the world needed a reason. Since the temple was only the ruins of a civilization and a museum, then the voice in the temple had invited the 3 of them into the temple. Naturally, there was something he needed to do. Things developed as Fan Xian expected. The green bird on the snowy platform suddenly chirped a few times and flapped its wings toward the misty sky. It only flew about 100 feet high before it suddenly turned into countless spots of light and disappeared into the air. Haitang and 13th Wang's bodies trembled. Using their fastest speed, they moved closer to Fan Xian and protected his entire body. They were terrified that the change in the temple would cause Fan Xian, the weakest person, to die. Fan Xian was not afraid at all. He only narrowed his eyes and looked coldly at the slowly descending spots of light. The spots of light fell into the air above the platform and began to coalesce together like countless fireflies in the summer night sky. For some mysterious reason, they had arranged themselves into a certain shape. The spots of light gradually grew brighter and dimmer, revealing a gradually clearer figure in the air. The lines grew clearer. They could see clearly the flowing clouds at the corners of the sleeves, the black gold and jade belt at the waist, and the upturned shoes at the feet. An elder in a wide-sleeved ancient robe appeared in midair. It was impossible to see his features clearly, but it was possible to clearly see his existence. His feet were not standing on the platform. Instead, he was floating in the air. He was clearly there, but Haitang and 13th Wang could not feel a trace of his breathing or heartbeat. They didn't even feel his existence. Standing in the air, it was as if he wanted to go with the wind. His wide sleeves danced gently on the platform. A faint light enveloped the elder's entire body. Such a scene stunned the hearts of the three people in front of the platform. To be able to dance in the air and emit golden light, what level of cultivation was this? No, this was no cultivation. This was clearly a celestial technique. Other than the immortals in the temple, who else could appear in front of the people in such a way that made people want to kneel and worship? Haitang and 13th Wang opened their dazed eyes and looked at the scene in front of them that they could not understand no matter what. Naturally, they connected the existence formed by the green bird to the legendary immortals in the temple. Their bodies trembled uncontrollably. Naturally, they knelt down and sincerely knelt toward the snowy ground. Fan Xian also knelt down. His knees sank into the thin, soft snow. His body began to tremble like a mortal who had sunk into excitement and could not free himself. No one could explain the scene in front of them. Even the civilization of Fan Xian's previous life could not create such a miraculous phenomenon. The immortal standing in the air, glowing with a bright light, appeared very real. He was truly like a god. However, most of Fan Xian's excitement and fear were still fake. He forced himself to calm down. His mind spun quickly as he analyzed the immortal who had appeared in front of him. If this temple was a museum and, as the people in the temple said, a military museum, then how could there be immortals? Since it was not an immortal, then what was it? Fan Xian had lived 2 lives and had never squeezed out his brain cells like he did today. His head was slightly lowered as he thought furiously. Was it the holographic image he had heard of in his previous life? Fan Xian didn't throw a handful of snow over to see if it would pass through the immortal's body. Once he made up his mind, his fear naturally lessened a great deal. Like Haitang and 13th Wang, he knelt sincerely in front of the snowy platform. Northern Chi's Tiani Dao, Haitang, greets immortals. Haitang Duoduo thought that the immortal in the temple would certainly know of the Qing mountain branch, the Tiani Dao school that worshipped the temple and spread the temple's benevolent ideals. Dongyi's sword hut, 13th Wang. 13th Wang's voice was a bit strange. This brave young man was probably finally confused by the mental blow. Qing Kingdom's Fan Xian. Fan Xian did not hide his true name. The last temple emissary had died at Uncle Wu Zhu's hands because of the emperor's ruthless methods. Presumably, the temple did not know of his connection to Yi Qingmei. He was only thinking about what the temple wanted to do by opening its doors wide to the 3 of them. If the temple had pretended to be immortals in this world's myths and legends for countless years, then, presumably, they would continue acting today. To pretend to be immortals, they had to be extremely pretentious and put on airs. Only then would they be able to scare people like Haitang and 13th Wang. If they didn't speak first, the temple would probably not have any reaction. The 3 of us came from the south. Fan Xian recounted the hardships on the snowy plains in a raspy voice to prove their determination and their worship and yearning for the temple. Haitang and 13th Wang finally came to their senses and knew that Fan Xian was lying. They couldn't help but feel shocked. They thought that immortals could tell if they were loyal or not with a single thought. To lie in front of an immortal, Fan Xian was being too daring. You are the creatures of the world, the people the mighty temple looks upon with pity. The icy and snowy road proves your determination. If you have any doubts, you need the guidance of light, and the light is right in front of you. The immortal that the green bird had transformed into finally spoke. There was not a trace of emotion in his voice. Strangely, it was not icy cold. On the contrary, it had a sense of warmth and intimacy. The immortal's voice echoed through the empty and silent temple, buzzing. No one knew whether the voice came from the immortal's lips or from all directions in the world. The miraculous appearance of these words made Haitang and 13th Wang once again confirm their judgment that the other party was an immortal. However, Fan Xian smiled coldly in his heart. It was nothing more than an upgraded version of a loud cough. The light was right in front. Did they need guidance? The people of the world were miserable. If they had any doubts, they could ask the immortals in the temple for help. Thus, Fan Xian opened his mouth. Most noble immortal, we want to know who we are, where we came from, and where we are going. They had come from the south and had already reached the temple. Who knew where they were going? The green bird led them to the stone platform but was unable to tell them this philosophical, awkward-sounding question. After the immortal heard Fan Xian's 3 questions, he immediately fell silent. His clothes fluttering in the cold air immediately became stiff and did not tremble at all. Haitang and 13th Wang did not understand why Fan Xian would ask these 3 questions. Fan Xian had already slowly stood up. His eyes were unusually calm and cold as he looked at the immortal who had sunk into silence. Through careful observation, he finally confirmed his judgment. You are you. You came from where you came from, and you are going to where you are going. The immortal's clothes fluttered. His voice was still warm and his reply was mysterious. This reply fell into Haitang's and 13th Wang's ears. If it fell into anyone's ears, it would seem particularly beautiful. However, this was the reply Fan Xian wanted. He looked calmly at the glowing figure floating in the air and thought to himself that it had taken such a long time to search through the database. It looked like the temple's energy was about to run out. It was clear that the immortal was not angry at Fan Xian for standing up straight and looking at him rudely. Amidst the light, he gazed warmly at Fan Xian. That is not the answer I want, Fan Xian said. An answer is just an answer. Whether or not you need it is actually just a question of your heart. The immortal's reply was still full of the air of a quack. Fan Xian was silent for a moment and then said, I want to know the temple's past. The immortal once again fell silent. The light enveloping his clothes immediately dimmed. Fan Xian stared unblinkingly at the patch of light and silently begged in his heart. If you are truly a holographic image, if you are truly just a guide for this museum, complete your mission and narrate this already lost history. If someone could actually enter the legendary temple, perhaps they would want the golden touch, the art of immortality, or those incomparably miraculous martial secrets. Fan Xian was different. What he wanted to know the most was the history of the temple. Outside the door of the temple, he had once blurted out the words, museum. It was clear that the person in the temple had not guessed because of those 3 people that there was a soul faintly connected to him in Fan Xian's body. The immortal's clothes froze for a long time. The light dimmed a great deal. Perhaps the thoughts of the people dancing in the spots of light were weighing some kind of permission to enter. Chapter 751. I'm tired, I'm sick, I'm rushing around everywhere, I basically don't drink, and in the end, I'm also exhausted. Oh, I'm really a useless person. The cows are always losing, crying sadly, just like how they sighed during the law net last time. There's nothing perfect in this world to begin with. On the 10th day of the new year, the update resumed, and then with a spurt of energy. Chapter 752. Why did the temple appear? Why did it appear? Its past, present, and future were the target of Fan Xian's question. After Fan Xian's question rang out in the snow-covered temple, the fairy that the green bird had transformed into sank into silence. Haitang and 13th Wang also sensed the change in Fan Xian's emotions. Forcefully suppressing the nervousness in their hearts, they raised their head. In such a wondrous temple of ice and snow, only Fan Xian could maintain his calm. Even those as powerful as Haitang and 13th Wang had become naked babies. Under the gaze of the fairy on the snowy platform, they could not feel a trace of disrespect. The fairy was silent for a long time. He then said to Fan Xian standing at his feet, This is not something that mortals should attempt to come into contact with or understand. I've never thought of myself as a mortal. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked at the specks of light in the air. Lowering his voice, he said, "Similarly, I also don't think of you as an immortal. The temple could faintly influence the thousands of years of history of this land. Additionally, there was a law that the temple could not interfere in worldly affairs." Fan Xian knew that in order to maintain his lofty and mysterious position, regardless of whether the temple was a relic or some strange object beside it, it would certainly follow the stories in the legends of the people and disguise itself as an illusory existence. "Since you don't want to tell us, then please tell us, why did you invite us into the temple?" Fan Xian's eyes stared directly at the strange sight and person formed by the specks of light in the air. Calmly, he said, "No mortal has ever been able to enter the temple. You let us in, presumably you have a request for us." Haitang and 13th Wang had already heard something strange in the conversation between Fan Xian and the fairy. Slowly, they rose from the snowy ground. They found that Fan Xian was still able to converse so calmly in front of a supreme existence beyond the scope of common people's understanding. They truly admired him greatly. However, Haitang Duoduo and 13th Wang still did not understand. Was Fan Xian really going to discuss some sort of deal with the fairy in the temple? Why was he not in a hurry to find the whereabouts of the blind master? Haitang stood gently behind Fan Xian and followed his gaze to the sky. It was just this glance, but it had already used up all the courage in her body. It was also this glance that suddenly moved her heart. Fan Xian was standing in front of the fairy. Why couldn't she? "I've had many professions in the secular world, but I'm still best at business," Fan Xian said. "That is why I am a merchant who only cares about profit. I don't like to reap without sowing. I also don't want to do things that harm my own interests just to be shrouded in the light of the temple. Whatever you want us to do for the temple, you must pay a price." From the moment he entered the temple until now, Fan Xian's entire state of mind had become unusually clear and calm. Yes, he still did not have a definite understanding of the temple, but he had to force himself to calm down and not think of the other person as a god. He could only think of the other person as a real existence. Furthermore, he faintly guessed that this trip to the temple had gone so smoothly because the person in the temple had some request of the three of them. He even had a general idea of that request. The path of the gods is dim, the path of the great path is not prosperous. Wandering on the wrong path, pointing to the mountains and rivers, angry at the wind and clouds, bringing peace to the country, therefore. The human figure formed by the spots of light on the snowy platform paused for a moment and then suddenly opened its mouth to read a long and ancient essay. The central meaning was actually very simple. The fairy in the temple hoped that Fan Xian, Haitang, and 13th Wang could become the emissaries of the temple and secretly observe the world on behalf of the temple. They also wanted to choose an appropriate time to return to the temple and report to the people in the temple. Haitang and 13th Wang sank into deep thought. Complicated emotions rose in their eyes. They had probably never thought that once they entered the temple, the immortals in the temple would not turn them into stone. Instead, they would give them such an important yet nonsensical mission. Observe the affairs of the world on behalf of the temple? In the future, if the three of them left the temple, they would probably never return. The people in the temple could not leave the temple to interfere in worldly affairs, so how could they control them? This was a very simple request. In the eyes of the disciples of Tianyi Dao, this was perhaps a supreme and particularly noble mission. However, in Fan Xian's eyes, this was just another confirmation of his guess. Could it be this is the legendary Tianmai being? Crabapple Dwudwa's heart trembled slightly as she thought of a term. In the legends, Tianmai individuals were known as the bloodline of the heavens. They would awaken once every several hundred years. Tianmai individuals could represent undefeatable battle prowess, or they could represent great talent in intelligence. These legendary figures would all disappear without a trace in the end. After Haitang Duoduo left Qing Mountain, she was also promoted by the Northern Qi court as this generation's Tianmai being. She was known as a genius. However, she knew that she was not one of those legendary figures. In comparison, Fan Xian, who could remain so calm in the face of an immortal and could spit out 300 poems in one night, was more like a Tianmai being. Not a Tianmai being. This kind of identity is only that of an emissary of the temple. Fan Xian suddenly broke the silence and opened his mouth to explain to the two friends beside him. This temple has already been abandoned. Other than this immortal, there are no other emissaries that can observe the movements of the world. More accurately speaking, those emissaries have all died in the human world. If the temple does not want to be forgotten by the world and not want to forget this world, it must find an emissary again. Coincidentally, the three of us came to the temple and gave this immortal a chance. Of course, for him, this was not much of a gamble, because he believed that the experts of the world would be very willing to investigate the world on behalf of the high and mighty temple. Even your teacher could not forget about the temple before he died, much less the other people. Fan Xian glanced at 13th Wang and lowered his head slightly. If you want to be, then be. Presumably, this is the first time the temple has chosen outsiders to be emissaries. They don't have any rules or regulations. Strangely, Fan Xian said these words in front of the immortal on the snowy platform. It was as if he was not worried at all about angering the immortal. Indeed, this was the case. There was not a trace of change in emotion on the immortal's old face formed purely from light. He only waited coldly and woodenly for the three people below the platform to reply. The emissaries of the temple have all died. Of course, there were not many emissaries in the temple to begin with. That is why you thought of using the three of us as your eyes. However, the problem is that you cannot control our actions after we leave the temple. You are only making the only possible choice in a situation where you have no other choice. Fan Xian raised his head and looked at the patch of light. The corners of his mouth twitched slightly. However, I still want to gain some benefits. According to my analysis, the so-called Tianmai being is nothing more than, in the long river of history, you, through the emissaries walking the world, imparted knowledge that was not equal to that era to those people. In other words, Master Ku he is a Tianmai being. My emperor is also a Tianmai being. Everyone says that Tianmai beings only appear once every few hundred years, but it is clear that in recent decades, this land has been a bit too lively. The immortal's face did not tremble at all. He only bent his body slightly and looked down at Fan Xian, who was speaking calmly. A moment later, he said, "Those were unexpected circumstances. He is not a Tianmai being." Fan Xian nodded and did not refute these words. Regardless of whether it was the martial method that Master Ku he cultivated or the tyrannical Jinqi that the emperor practiced, they were all things that his mother, Yi Qingmei, had stolen from this rundown temple. There was no legitimacy to the inheritance, so the old man in the temple would not admit it. "Child, you know a lot of things." The immortal on the snowy platform watched Fan Xian warmly. "Don't call me child. I don't like being called that. As for the things I know, I do indeed know a lot. After all, I have my own thoughts. I am not like the emissaries you have sent into the world over the countless years, who have no emotions and thoughts of their own." Fan Xian did not shrink back and looked back into the immortal's deep eyes. Calmly, he said, "I even know that the large article you wrote earlier was actually all plagiarized phrases. From this, it can be seen that you can only do some simple gathering and writing work. You are unable to have your own creative abilities." Ever since he had stood up from the snowy ground, Fan Xian had been calm, even coldly speaking to this figure in the temple as an equal. It was as if he was not worried that this mysterious temple would easily kill him. However, this calmness was actually only a pretense. These emotions were based on his analysis of the temple and the knowledge of two lives. It is Qiu Wuzhou. It looks like you have truly surprised me and made me think of some things. However, if you are willing to become emissaries of the temple, I will not mind the rudeness of your words, the immortal said coldly. The immortal said coldly, the godly temple has never traded with mortals. Please remember this. Since you have remembered some things from the past, you know that not everyone in this world will be scared by you and then listen to whatever you say, the immortal said coldly. You are just a lonely old man. The people under your command have all died one by one. Other than us, who else in the world do you think can find this broken temple? Regardless of whether you let us leave or kill us, you can only be forever trapped in this snowy mountain and never know what exactly has happened in the world you calmly observe. Even if you can make an exception and make a deal, in reality, you have already received the temple's selfless gift. You know that as the children of the temple, you should contribute your strength to the sustainable development of the entire world. I don't know what the temple has bestowed on me. The immortal's gaze swept across the three people in front of the snowy platform. I chose you to enter the temple and gave this great mission to you because you all have the aura of the temple on you, particularly you. The immortal's gaze finally landed on Fan Xian's body. For Master Ku He to be able to become a great grandmaster, he had relied on the martial method that Yi Qingmei had stolen from the temple. Dongyi's unparalleled sword skills more or less carried some of the style of the emissaries of the temple. The one with the thickest aura was, of course, Fan Xian. He had lived with Uncle Wu Zhu since he was young. He was Yi Qingmei's son. The major martial methods that the temple had left in the world were all in his body. This immortal, who had guarded the temple for tens of thousands of years, could easily see this. You mean that you cannot give the three of us any more benefits? The corners of Fan Xian's mouth twitched slightly. Since it is so, we cannot enter the temple and return empty-handed. If you don't give, we can only search ourselves. As his words fell, the immortal in the light smiled slightly. It was as if he felt a glimmer of absurdity that an ant-like mortal dared to forcefully steal treasures from the temple under the gaze of a god. After Fan Xian finished speaking, he stopped talking to the dots of light. Instead, he circled around the stone platform and walked toward the most well-preserved building in the temple under the thin layer of snow. Haidang and 13th Wang jumped in fright. They didn't know if such an impolite action would anger the immortal in the temple. Would lightning descend in a moment and turn Fan Xian to dust? The face of the immortal formed by the dots of light on the snowy platform froze slightly. It was as if he had not expected Fan Xian's actions in all of his calculations. Immediately after, the immortal's body immediately disintegrated. In an instant, it appeared in front of Fan Xian's path and blocked the door to the well-preserved building. Disappearing and reappearing at such speed was indeed not something that could appear in the mortal world. However, Haitang Duo and 13th Wang forcefully suppressed the shock in their hearts. Turning into two streaks of smoke, they swept over in an attempt to protect Fan Xian's life under the immortal's furious attack. However, nothing happened. Fan Xian's footsteps did not pause at all. He walked straight into the human figure formed by the dots of light. The dots of light were not scattered by his body or flew off in all directions. They did not become countless bolts of lightning and explode him to pieces. Instead, they suddenly swelled and seemed to stick to Fan Xian's snowy robe. Just like this, under Haitang and 13th Wang's shocked gazes, Fan Xian walked straight into the immortal's light. He then walked out and approached the building's main door. A light breeze blew past. The immortal's light flared once again and suddenly appeared in front of the building's main door, blocking in front of Fan Xian. However, a wooden expression appeared in that pair of unfathomable, heaven-like eyes. Fan Xian calmly looked into the eyes of the immortal floating in the air. After a moment of silence, he said in a low voice, "I see through you." Chapter 753. In the extremely cold snowy mountains of the north, and the extremely cold misty temple, Fan Xian walked toward the building without turning his head. Once again, he broke through the body of the immortal. In this snow-covered world, countless dazzling spots of light appeared. No one noticed that under his snowy jacket, his back was already drenched. In such a cold climate, sweat seeped out of his body and soaked all of his undergarments. His expression remained calm. No one knew how much courage and determination he had gathered in that instant when he charged into the immortal's body. Fan Xian did not know what kind of unfathomable power the temple possessed. Was it as the Emperor and Uncle Wu Zhu said, and had already fallen to a certain degree? However, it was clear that Uncle Wu Zhu had been lost in the temple. This made him feel a natural fear of the temple. However, he still wanted to gamble. Looking at it now, it seemed that he had won the gamble. The immortal's body formed by the spots of light clearly did not have any great power. It was closer to the hologram Fan Xian had guessed earlier. However, there were still many secrets in the temple and many things that could not be explained clearly, such as the dense yuanqi in the surroundings and the secret martial arts manuals his mother had once stolen. In that world, perhaps there was the Chun Taiji manual, but it was certainly not as wondrous as the tyrannical martial secret. Fan Xian's thin lips trembled slightly as he stepped over the threshold of the undamaged building. His hands were behind his back as he made a gesture to Haitang and 13th Wang. He hoped that these two companions would be able to stand strong under the might of the temple and help him. He charged into the building. The spots of light followed him in like fireflies, leaving behind an empty patch of snowy ground and the snowy platform without the footprints of a green bird. The two heavy doors closed silently, shutting Fan Xian inside but shutting Haitang and 13th Wang outside. Haitang and 13th Wang had not yet shaken off their shock. They didn't know where Fan Xian found the courage to pass through the immortal's body. They also didn't understand why the immortal had been pushed into a patch of spots of light by Fan Xian. They were more worried about Fan Xian's safety behind the tightly shut door. Haitang Duoduo's eyes narrowed slightly. Light flared in her eyes. Just as she was about to raise all her cultivation and force her way through, 13th Wang suddenly opened his mouth and said, "His hand signal is for us to stay outside and use this opportunity to find someone." Fan Xian had taken such a great risk and left Haitang and 13th Wang outside the door in the hopes that they could use the opportunity he had fought for with his life to search for traces of Uncle Wu Zhu in the temple. Fan Xian had traveled thousands of li and tirelessly come to the temple because of his closest uncle. This was a building that looked like an ancient temple, but the building material inside was not ordinary bluestone, but a material similar to metal. Fan Xian's pupils constricted slightly. He quickly scanned the inside of the hall. He found that the building was empty. There was nothing out of the ordinary. There were only patches of empty space. Based on the name of the museum, one could faintly think that countless years ago, this place was perhaps an exhibition stand. The murals on the outside of the temple had long fallen. However, the murals in this building were still well preserved. One could clearly see the scenes painted on them. Fan Xian placed his hands behind his back and bent his body like an old man. He carefully walked in front of these murals. His gaze swept across them meticulously and carefully. Since the immortal formed by the light spots was not willing to tell him the truth of history, then he could only find the truth himself. As Fan Xian bent his body and looked intently at the murals, the immortal formed by the light spots floated behind him like a ghost. Fan Xian knew this, but he didn't turn his head to look. He also didn't open his mouth to ask anything. The scene was very strange. Being followed by an immortal or a ghost, Fan Xian couldn't help but feel a bit scared. However, he appeared unusually calm. The style of these murals was very similar to the oil paintings Fan Xian knew from his previous life. The contents depicted were all ancient myths that were occasionally mentioned in the classics of the land. However, the faces of the gods were very blurry. Regardless of whether they were thundering on the summit of a mountain, floating in the sea, or bathing in the magma of a volcano, there was always a strange white fog that covered their true faces. Fan Xian's heart thumped. He once again thought of the murals in the Qing Temple in Jingdou and the murals in the Qing Temple on Dong Mountain. The contents depicted on these murals were events from thousands or tens of thousands of years ago. They must have been passed down through countless generations, so it was inevitable that they were blurry. However, this temple was the source of all legend. Why were the faces of the gods on these murals still blurry? The immortal in the temple, who had been following Fan Xian's footsteps like a wisp of light, suddenly said, "These murals were created by Bor. Bor? 300 years ago, the great magician in the West. I heard that he and his wife, Fu Bo, were both Tianmai beings. In the end, they disappeared without a trace. So, in the end, they returned to the temple," Fan Xian said with furrowed brows. "Tianmai beings are chosen by the temple to spread the seeds of wisdom into the world. I had thought that these Tianmai beings, in the end, would have strange thoughts in their hearts and be killed by the emissaries the temple sent out. Unexpectedly, there were still some who returned to the temple alive. The temple forbids interfering in the affairs of the world. Naturally, they would not kill people. However, you are right. After countless years, there will always be Tianmai beings who inherited the temple's teachings. They will have wild thoughts in their hearts and cause suffering for the common people. Whenever this happens, the temple will send out emissaries and have them disappear without a trace. This is probably the reason why the legendary Tianmai beings all disappeared without a trace in the end." Fan Xian noticed that the wisp of light behind him still had a calm and warm tone. However, when he referred to him, he used "sir" and began to communicate with him. But Bor and Fubo, the couple, were a different matter. They did not have any worldly desires. After Fubo died, Bor experienced endless hardship and returned to the temple. Coincidentally, the murals in the temple were almost broken, so he spent 7 years to repair the murals in the temple. But the history of the Qing Temple in Dong Mountain and the Jingdou Qing Temple is more than 300 years. How could those murals still be Bor's style? Because Bor only repaired and did not create, he followed the style of the murals from many years ago. Naturally, it is similar to the murals in the world you grew up in. Fan Xian suddenly pointed at the sky full of flames and light in the murals. Narrowing his eyes, he asked, "Why don't those gods have faces?" "Because true gods never show their faces to others. So, you are not a true god." The spots of light floating in the air behind Fan Xian gradually shed the old man's face and transformed into a mirror-like existence. After a long silence, it said, "Just as you said earlier, I am not a god." "Very good. I was just worried that you had gone crazy after being cooped up in this snowy mountain for tens of thousands of years and truly thought of yourself as a god. Then, this matter would not be easy to deal with." Hearing the voice of the temple itself coming from all around him, Fan Xian's mood relaxed slightly. At least, the craziest and most terrifying possibility had been denied by the temple itself. If it was an existence that truly had life and emotions, hearing Fan Xian's words, it would certainly understand the meaning hidden within. However, it was clear that the existence in the temple was only passively thinking according to some established process, and did not continue to say anything. It's not that gods don't have faces. There are no gods. For some reason, after Fan Xian said these words, his mood suddenly became desolate. If there truly were no gods in the world, then his existence and his mother's existence would remain unfathomable and without reason. Those are just some powerful machines or weapons. Fan Xian pointed at the gods on the murals that could split open the earth and said quietly, "I don't know what kind of weapons they are. Atomic bombs or neutron bombs. In any case, they are all very terrifying things." After the thread of light floating in the air heard Fan Xian's words, the mirror-like surface suddenly gave off a powerful ripple. It was as if it was undergoing intense thinking. Perhaps it was because Fan Xian had said something it had never imagined it would hear that made it unable to analyze it clearly in a short time. The light in the building was not very dazzling. It was faint and gently sprinkled on Fan Xian's body like it was giving him a layer of holy light. Perhaps it was because of the need to preserve the exhibits or because the temple's energy was about to run out, but the light was not very bright. Fan Xian walked forward silently until he had seen all of the murals. Only then did he return to the center of the building. Turning his head back to look at the thread of light floating in the air, he was silent for a long time. He then said, "By now, you should know that I am not a normal person. My two companions are not here at this time, so I think you don't have to be afraid of anything. You can tell me about the temple's origins." The mirror-like surface formed by the light sank into a deathly stillness. It seemed to be analyzing whether or not Fan Xian's request could be approved. Throwing a brick to attract jade. "Let me throw a brick first." Fan Xian coughed and felt a wave of weakness. Slowly, he sat down on the icy ground. As he slowly absorbed the yuanqi that was everywhere between heaven and earth, he slowly said in a raspy voice, "The temple is a historical site, the remains of some civilization. Using your words, this is a military museum. Thus, it keeps the top and most terrifying existences of that civilization. You won't tell me the history of the temple, so I can only guess based on these murals and some of my knowledge. That civilization is certainly one I am familiar with." Fan Xian slowly closed his eyes and thought of what Xiaoan had said in the cave, as well as what Uncle Wu Zhu had once said. Not long after his mother escaped the temple the first time, she should have returned to the temple to find Uncle Wu Zhu. Since that was the case, that chest should have been stolen from the temple by his mother the second time. There was a barrett in the military museum, so it was clear that this museum had existed much later than when Fan Xian had left. Furthermore, it was a civilization of the same origin. Fan Xian did not believe that some ancient civilization could make a gun that was exactly the same as the one he had made. He thought of the familiar civilization of the same origin as the world he had once lived in. It had already become a shadow in history, a broken temple in the snowy mountains that people could not touch. The people Fan Xian, no, the people Fan Xian had once loved, hated, and pitted had long become wisps of ghosts in the long river of time. The things he had once wandered, seen, and admired had all become yellow sand. A glimmer of pain grew in his heart. The pain was not very strong, but it was particularly clear. It was sour and particularly frustrated. He had never seen anyone before or after. Other than Yi Qingmei, there was only him. The world was long. How could he endure it? Such tens of thousands of years of loneliness had fallen on his body alone. How heavy was it? Fan Xian sat on the ground and coughed repeatedly. His breathing was hurried. After a long time, an indifferent and dim light rose in his eyes. His expression was not a smile. Looking at the mirror in the air formed from light spots, he asked, "As someone who once traveled with you, can you tell me exactly how that world was destroyed? Did a madman really start to throw nuclear bombs around for fun?" The mirror of light was as smooth as ice. After a long time, the warm and steady voice rang out in all directions inside the building. It was a great battle in the divine realm. The immortals all used shocking treasures and raised shocking waves. The ground changed shape and volcanoes erupted. Enough! Fan Xian's angry voice rang out in the empty building. He stared fixedly at the mirror and coughed violently. In the end, he coughed up a trickle of blood. He stubbornly wiped away the blood at the corner of his lips and cursed at the mirror. "I am that stupid person from the divine realm. Don't talk about this shit. You're AF King Broken Museum, not some F King Temple." Inside the Qing royal palace, full of spring, a clear and icy voice slowly rang out in the royal study. The wooden door to the royal study was slightly opened to make it easier for air to enter. Eunuch Yao and the other eunuchs and serving girls waited carefully outside the room and did not enter. Living high in the temple, one worries about the people. Living far from the Jianghu, one worries about the ruler. There is worry about advancing and worry about retreating. But when should one be happy? It must be said. First worry about the worries of the world, then enjoy the joys of the world. Fan Ruoro quietly finished reading the article and closed the page. She then walked to a corner of the royal study and began to stare blankly. She looked at the flourishing spring trees outside the window and couldn't help but think of her brother. She heard that they had gone north. What was there in the north? Was the legendary temple in the north? She heard that the extreme north was covered in ice and snow all year round. It was not a place normal people could get close to. Was her brother well? It was already the end of spring. 4 months had passed since the last change in the palace. The entire royal palace was enveloped in a warm and beautiful sunlight. However, the royal study maintained an icy coldness. The Qing emperor lay on a soft couch with a thin blanket covering his body. His face was pale and his eyes were lifeless. Following Fan Ruoro's gaze, he looked at the green trees outside the window. For some reason, the emperor particularly loathed the existence of these green trees. Perhaps it was because he felt that the passing of spring and the arrival of autumn and the replacement of all things was an irresistible rule of nature. Worry about the ruler, worry about the people. Back then, Anji spoke up in the northern Qi royal palace. In the end, he was forced by the little emperor to write a paragraph. In the end, he only wrote this paragraph without a head or tail, the emperor slowly said. The emperor opened his mouth and slowly said, "I just don't understand. How could a boy who could write such words do such a disrespectful thing?" After so much time had passed, the Qing court knew that the traitor Fan Xian had long escaped Jingdo. The intelligence reports sent back from the north accurately pointed to Fan Xian's whereabouts. What surprised many Qing officials was that after Fan Xian escaped Jingdo, he did not throw himself into the arms of the northern Qi court. Even more surprising was that the emperor seemed to only focus his anger on Fan Xian and did not begin a purge within the Qing kingdom. The emperor's eyes narrowed slightly. His sparse eyelashes were like an ominous broken autumn leaf as they drooped on his increasingly wrinkled face. His gaze flitted across Fan Ruoro's shoulder. Suddenly, he asked, "Am I really not a good emperor?" This was a lamentable and absurd question. How the Qing emperor did on the throne was a question that needed to be acknowledged by history. However, for some reason, this most powerful man in the world especially needed to obtain the approval of certain people. At the beginning, he had wanted to put Fan Xian under house arrest in Jingdo because he wanted to use Fan Xian's eyes to tell those people who had died. Now, Fan Xian had rebelled. He was used to asking Fan Ruoro this question. It was clear that he had asked this question more than once. Fan Ruoro didn't even turn her head. She calmly replied, "This is not a question I should answer." Suddenly, Eunuch Yao's voice rang out from outside the royal study. "Imperial consort Yi has arrived." Princess Chen has arrived. Before he had finished speaking, Imperial consort Yi and Lin Wan'er walked in. It was clear that these two women had come many times during this period of time. The emperor only glanced at them coldly and did not open his mouth to scold them. He didn't tell them to get out. He allowed them to come to the side of the soft couch and help his body up. Lin Wan'er changed all of the blankets on the soft couch. As she wiped the fine sweat from her forehead, she smiled and said, "It's all new cotton from Zhongzhou. The embroidery is all the most fashionable in Chuanzhou. Try it and see if it's comfortable." Imperial consort Yi took out a few ingredients from the food box and carefully fed the emperor. As she fed, she nagged, "The sun has been good these 2 days. Your Majesty should go out and walk around." The emperor coldly said, "Don't you find it annoying to come every day?" It's not like I can't move. The Emperor's injury had indeed not healed. Contrary to the expectations of Fan Ruoro and the Imperial Academy of Medicine, it was strangely lingering. Perhaps it was because he was old. If he had been at the peak of the Qing Emperor's power, no matter how serious his injury, he would probably have long recovered. It was as if Lin Wan-er didn't hear her uncle's words. With a sweet smile, she began to massage his shoulders. Fan Ruoro watched for a while, and couldn't resist shaking her head. She sat on the other side of the Emperor and began to massage him. The royal study sank into silence. Imperial Consort Yi sat quietly in front of the Emperor and watched this scene with a slight smile. There was no purge in the court. The officials of the He faction had been slaughtered by Fan Xian. On the contrary, it had turned the court into an iron bucket. The third prince, Li Qingping, had recently, under who the scholars lead, begun to try to come into contact with political affairs. Although Consort Mei's belly was very big, no matter how one looked at it, the Qing kingdom was in a strange state of stability. At least, in the eyes of the people, the emperor had no intention of changing the heir. Nothing seemed to have changed in the Qing kingdom. On the contrary, it seemed to have become better, except for the young man called Fan Xian. He had disappeared from the world for almost half a year. No one knew where he was or if he was still alive. Lin Wan-er did not return to Danzhou with her entire family as Fan Xian had planned. Instead, she calmly stayed in Jingdou. Furthermore, she entered the palace more often than before. This scene shocked countless people. "Tomorrow I will go to court. Don't come." After a long silence, the emperor suddenly spoke. His tone was cold, but there was a thread of heaviness that was difficult to detect. Perhaps it was such a man who actually enjoyed the service of his family these days. However, these family members were, after all, the family of the son who dared to oppose him. "Yes, Your Majesty." Lin Wan-er smiled warmly and didn't say anything more. She knew exactly what she was doing. She also knew that she was only inheriting Fan Xian's thoughts. Don't hope for that kid to come back alive. If he does come back, even if I can spare his life, the officials of the world will not allow him to live. The emperor slowly closed his eyes. The corners of his lips drooped like his eyelashes. He appeared tired. Could Fan Xian come back alive? This was a question that weighed heavily on everyone's hearts. The emperor's words clearly cut off everyone's path of retreat. The emperor continued to close his eyes tightly and coldly said, "You all don't know why he had to find the temple, but I know that he wanted Lao Wu to come back and kill me. For such a heartless son, should I have any pity for him?" Now that the situation had developed to this point, the Qing emperor had already shown rare magnanimity by not beating all the people related to Fan Xian into dust. Of course, it was mostly because of the agreement between him and Fan Xian. After all, he didn't know if Fan Xian was dead or not. Although it seemed that since ancient times, no one had ever been able to find the temple on their own, much less rescue someone from the temple, the emperor still could not relax. He knew that a woman had once done it. Would his son with that woman bring another great surprise to the world? If Lao Wu truly came back with Fan Xian, what would happen to him? What would happen to the world? The emperor suddenly opened his eyes. A cold light shone through them. "Summon Yi Zhong into the palace." Chapter 754. The dark gray land was burning, the dark blue sea was burning, and the boundless sky was burning. Everything in the world seemed to be enveloped by the blazing flames, trying its best to squeeze out every bit of fuel in its body, adding it to the raging flames. The volcano erupted, and the boiling red magma submerged into the seawater, evaporating endless fog. It also drove the ocean currents to set off huge waves that were each taller than the last, constantly slamming against the land that had long been melted into a strange shape. The world was filled with terrifying light and heat, filled with the smell of destruction. The animals on the land screamed miserably, their fur rotten, and their bones could be seen. It was as if the light, the waves, and the flames were soul-devouring flames from the netherworld that they could never escape. No matter how far they escaped from the burning forest, no matter how deep they dug into the deep holes under the grassland, they still could not escape the destruction that could destroy all living beings. The animals in the sea were also swimming uneasily, desperately avoiding the heat and poisonous gases that surged out from the deep trenches at the bottom of the sea. The mammals that were used to swimming freely in the cold sea poked their heads out of the water in extreme despair, but what entered their lungs was boiling air and the dust that carried fatal toxins. The birds in the sky were still flying with all their might, far away from the dazzling light in the sky, desperately flying towards the two ends of the land. The natural sensitivity of life made them know that they could probably only find the final paradise in those places where people rarely went. This was a great migration that was completely out of sync with the season, and in this migration, most of the birds still died on the way, landing on the withered land. There were very few birds that could truly hide from the blazing light and the black dust. The light in the world gradually dimmed, but the air was filled with dust and dark clouds, mercilessly blocking the round sun above their heads. The entire green grassland had long changed color. The animals that had survived the calamity gathered around a small pool, desperately fighting for the only clean water source. More than 30 large crocodiles hid in the depths of the pool, and countless animals around the pool gathered and began to dig small puddles. Some bold and strong carnivores bravely began to attack the crocodiles' territory. There were no longer any traces of birds in the sky, and the fish at the bottom of the sea had long been frightened into the coral reefs in the deep sea, not daring to come out. The sharks swimming around opened their large eyes in confusion, not knowing what had happened to this world, and what had happened to their home. And on the surface of the sea, more than 10 huge sperm whales floated tiredly, occasionally flicking their tails weakly. Further away on the edge of the small island, the sea lions roared at the sky in despair and anger, mercilessly biting each other to vent the fear in the depths of their hearts. The animals gathered around the pool gradually died. Some died from killing each other, some died from inhaling the black dust in the air, some died from hunger, some died from thirst, and most of the animals actually died from drinking the water in the pool. The air was dry, and there were only countless pale bones left around the pool. Some were large, some were small, some were curled up, and some were crouching in fear. Their fur and flesh had long returned to the earth, leaving only these white bones in the surroundings, accompanying the most powerful reptiles in the pool, the reptiles that had not perished after tens of millions of years. After a few more days, the pool dried up. The large crocodiles that weighed hundreds of kilograms lay on the soil as if resigned to their fate, allowing the red mud on their backs to be burned by the not-so-blazing sun. They gradually died, gradually withered, gradually rotted, and gradually turned into shocking white bones. In reality, these powerful reptiles were actually dried up in the end. The sky was still deathly silent. Other than the thick black clouds that rolled and pressed down on the ground, there were no signs of life. The scene on the surface of the sea was even more cruel. Where the warm ocean currents met the cold currents in the northern part of the bay, countless large aquatic mammals either floated in the seawater by the island or sank to the quiet bottom of the sea. The whales, sea lions, and manatees had long become rotten flesh, polluting the entire seawater and turning the entire bay into a field of carnage. The air was filled with a foul stench. The scavenging animals struggled at death's door for a longer time because of these huge existences. They acutely sensed that the closer they were to the shore of the land, the more the world was filled with the aura of death, so they were very careful when eating. Finally, one day, the dry, gloomy, hell-like world finally rained. The rainwater struck the few remaining leaves at the edge of the grassland, waking up the insects hiding in their holes. Round water droplets rolled on the muddy ground, and a beetle happily washed its face. The rainwater gradually gathered and followed the ancient waterway, heading deep into the grassland. Along the way, it woke up countless creatures that used sleep to avoid destruction. The trickling river flowed into the pool surrounded by white bones. What was surprising was that a lizard hiding deep in the cracks of the rocks in the river was still alive. It stuck out its red tongue and clumsily stepped across the shallow water, licking the white bones in the crocodile's huge eye sockets. Occasionally, it would extend its right front leg and announce to the surroundings that it owned the pool. In any case, there were more than 1,000 white skeletons around the pool, and they had all sunk into silence. It was impossible for them to express any objections to its announcement. If those lions and baboons were still alive, the world would be different. No matter which world it was in, rain always represented life. This time seemed to be no exception. The black dust that filled the air was washed away by the rain. The dust that could not be blown away by the wind finally yielded to the power of the water god. A fresh and pleasant smell appeared in the air again. The creatures in the wilderness were born because of the water, gathered because of the water, and began a happy new life after the disaster. They began to hunt and kill each other again. Even though it was a bloody hunt, it still carried a happy smell of life. However, these creatures did not know that the black dust carried by the rain that fell from the sky was terrifying. They also did not know that the rain could wash away the dust, but it could never wash away the invisible lines that filled the world but were enough to kill most life. When it rained, the sea was much calmer. The waves slowly pushed the corpses of the dead animals to the rocks on the shore, and the rotten smell was washed away by the rain. However, the rain became heavier and heavier as if it would never stop. The animals that drank the rain began to feel that their lives were slowly leaving their bodies. They did not know why, but the instinctive fear made them feel despair. In the pouring rain, they used the last of their strength and began to carry out a cruel and ruthless killing. They did not even spare their own compatriot. After countless floods, big and small, life on land was once again dealt a heavy blow. Other than leaving countless corpses soaked in the muddy water, there was no longer any trace of life. The rotten corpses that piled up at the edge of the sea were beaten into disgusting bubbles by the rain. It had nothing to do with the fairy tale at all. However, heaven's punishment for this world did not seem to be over. After the rain came a sudden frost. From north to south, the air suddenly dropped by more than 10 degrees. The sun could not be seen in the world, and the seasons seemed to be in chaos. The deep cold of winter appeared in front of life that was already in danger. After the frost came the endless snow. At first, the snowflakes were still black and gray, but in the end they returned to pure white, looking incomparably pure. They covered the sky, the earth, and the sea. The whole world was shrouded in wind and snow. The bitter cold descended on the earth, and the ice extended into the sea. The vast expanse of white was really clean. Endless snow fell endlessly. There was no longer any sign of life on the snowy ground. This scene continued calmly and coldly. 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, 100 years. It was a long time before he pulled his gaze away from the light mirror in the air. His eyes were bloodshot, and his lips were slightly white. Although everything shown in the scene earlier was the result of his analysis and judgment after entering the temple, truly seeing it happen in front of his eyes, the powerful sorrow and pain still made his heart ache even more. He knew that this was not the divine realm. He could not be like the people of this world and treat these as myths and then record them on murals and legends. He knew that all of this had truly happened. The lives that had died in the calamity had once truly existed. The bloodshot in his eyes represented exhaustion and mental and physical exhaustion. Fan Xian lowered his head and rubbed his eyes. He then raised his head again and gazed at the snowy scene in the mirror in the air that seemed to not change for tens of thousands of years. He knew that change would certainly happen. Otherwise, how could civilization have continued to the present world? What made his heart tremble was that even now, he still did not see what kind of terrifying torment the people in that world, his former companions, had suffered. Grand, wonderful, exquisite, simple buildings were completely different from grass nests and caves in this world. They were also the existences that had suffered the heaviest blow in the calamity. The people of that world had grasped some of the Creator's secret. In the end, they had thrown these weapons of mass destruction onto their heads. This was an absurd reality. The high temperature melted cement and steel. The shock wave shattered everything that remained. Invisible and nameless rays of light killed everyone. After the drought came the flood. After the frost came the wind and snow. Countless years passed. Under the cover of the boundless white snow, the glory it once had been covered up. No one knew that there had once been a race that had once been incomparably glorious in this world. After an unknown number of years of wind and snow, someone finally appeared in the scene once again. The destruction of civilization, the survival instinct of life, and the brutal killing appeared once again. In the wasteland, the only thing that could survive was to successfully display the side of animal nature that was most difficult for human nature to accept in order to survive. Fan Xian did not want to see this, so the scene quickly spun and moved. It was as if he was sitting in front of a time machine, watching the fall of civilization, the remnants of civilization, and the remnants of the fire of civilization disappear into the wastelands. He watched as the remaining tall buildings under the snow were eroded by the wind and snow and collapsed. After the ice and snow, the weeds took over their bodies. Using the power of time, feng shui, and nature, they turned into pieces of rock and rusted gravel. None of their original appearance could be seen. He watched as the people dressed in animal skins moved back into their caves, built grass huts, and picked up bone arrows again. However, they forgot words and language. Buildings rose, buildings collapsed, and buildings rose again. In the past, Fan Xian had always thought that civilization was the existence with the most life force. No matter how great of a blow it suffered, it could always rely on a few sparks to start a new prairie fire. However, as he watched the scenes flashing quickly across the mirror, only then did he know that civilization itself was the weakest thing in the world. When the material world that civilization relied on was lost, the spiritual aspect was always so easily forgotten. The scene flashed by in an instant, but hundreds of thousands of years had already passed in this world. The last glory did not leave any trace in this world, and completely disappeared. Fan Xian watched all of this happen. His eyes were confused and slightly red. Sitting cross-legged on the ground, he clenched his fists tightly. In an instant, he saw 1,000 years. The stone beside him had not rotted, but tens of thousands of years had passed. He truly saw the sea turn into mulberry fields, the stars move, and the earth change. He saw the once bay become fertile soil. He didn't know if the nutrients left behind by the countless dead animals would be of any help to this change in the world. He saw the deathly grassland rise slightly after the volcanic activity calmed. Freed from the threat of the flood, a tribe of primitive people came from the northeast. They began to arduously chase away the wild animals and use slash-and-burn cultivation. After an indeterminable amount of time, a blind man covered in black cloth stepped through the ice and snow in the north and came to the tribe of ancient humans. He was called an emissary by later generations. The emissary came from the north and taught the skill of weaving net. The people of the tribe bowed to the north and praised the favor of the gods. Another emissary came from the north and taught the method of knotting ropes to record events. The people of the tribe again praised the grace of the gods. Another emissary came from the north and taught the matter of writing. The people of the tribe built altars and painted paintings on the mountain walls. They praised the grace of the temple. Fan Xian buried his head deep into his knees. His hurried breathing made his back rise and fall. He was silent for an indeterminable amount of time. He finally understood most of the things. Ever since he confirmed that this was Earth, there were many things he did not understand. Why did the words used in this world just happen to be the words he knew in his previous life? Why did the words in this world not seem to have undergone an overly complicated process of evolution? It was as if they had been like this from the beginning. I have a question. Why is it that everything is gone, but you, or perhaps the temple, is still able to be preserved? Fan Xian's voice was very raspy. He had basically confirmed that the time of the calamity should have happened after his death. However, it could not have been too long after his death, because he was unfamiliar with the construction and craftsmanship of this temple. However, in terms of technology and civilization, there was nothing he did not understand yet. On the smooth mirror of light, scenes of the tribe people's joys and sorrows continued to play out. The hot-blooded sacrifice during the opening up of the wastelands continued to play out. These remnant people who had experienced hundreds of thousands of years of cold and deathly stillness had long forgotten that they were ancient existences too far away. However, they were, after all, humans who had already evolved once. When the environment of this world allowed them to move about relatively freely, the intelligence hidden deep in the collective unconscious finally exploded. In particular, the black-clothed emissary from the north would descend upon the tribe every once in a while and bring the grace of the temple. This quickly catalyzed the progress of human society and civilization. Just like a game with a plug-in, the scene in the light mirror progressed extremely quickly. It seemed like the human race did not spend hundreds of thousands of years to develop to its present state. However, since many years ago, the black-veiled emissary had never appeared in the world again. The ones who took up this task were the emissaries who walked the world, as well as the Tianmai practitioners who were taught by those emissaries. When Fan Xian asked his question, the scene in the mirror just happened to stop on a lone peak. Countless commoners were frantically and courageously digging stone steps on the mountain. They then transported stone and wood to the summit of the mountain to build a temple there. This lonely sea was by the sea. Half of the mountain was like green jade and as smooth as a mirror. It faced the sun of the East Sea. It was the Dong Mountain that Fan Xian was very familiar with and had even personally climbed. The temple's voice once again rang out in all directions. Its tone was still warm, but there was still no hint of true emotion. For the museum's beautiful appearance to be preserved, it is all due to luck. Using the words of the people of the world, this is fate. Yes, other than fate and luck, what else could explain the ruins of a civilization from hundreds of thousands of years ago still lying quietly in the snowy mountains, calmly and warmly watching each step of the remnant people of the world? Perhaps only the eternal and unchanging ice and snow could withstand the power of time. Nature's unintentional destruction did not make the temple disappear without a trace in the long river of time like those grand buildings. The temple used solar energy. Perhaps this was one of the reasons. However, it was clear that the ancient war could not bring about such a large change in the world. Did something big happen to the earth itself? Fan Xian could have thought deeply about this question, but the emotions in his head were unusually violent, particularly when he saw the black-clothed blind emissary and the scene on the jade wall of Dong Mountain that appeared at the end. It made his mouth dry and tongue dry. He was unable to speak. If everything in the scene was true, then what was Uncle Wu Zhu? A prophet of the entire human society? A teacher? Thinking of how he had grown up with Uncle Wu Zhu and had truly lived by the side of a legend, Fan Xian's body couldn't help but tremble. But I don't believe that you are the only place left in the world. Fan Xian's raspy voice trembled. It sounded strange. That doesn't make sense. Time can prove everything. I have spent hundreds of thousands of years in this world and have not found a similar existence. The temple's voice rang out calmly by Fan Xian's ear. The voice of the temple rang out beside Fan Xian's ear. It was very calm. For me to be able to survive until now and continue to complete my mission of helping humankind, on one hand, is luck. On the other hand, during these hundreds of thousands of years, the emissaries have been endlessly repairing the temple. Unfortunately, the emissaries have gradually been used up by time. Although the temple's voice said it was a pity, there was no such emotion in its tone. Fan Xian closed his eyes and thought deeply for a long time. He then pointed at the great Dong Mountain in the mirror and the temple that was gradually being completed. "I've been to this place before. Why did you send out a prophecy through the emissaries and build a temple there?" As he passed by Dong Mountain from the sea, each time he saw the neat and tidy jade wall that seemed to have been cut by a god's sword, Fan Xian's state of mind would waver. Looking at the impossible scene in this world, he always felt that the jade wall did not seem to be formed naturally. If it was done by a human, what kind of power did it take? What Fan Xian didn't understand the most was why Uncle Wu Zhu had gone to Dong Mountain to recover after he was injured. Why did the emperor choose Dong Mountain for his final battle? To commemorate. The temple's voice was silent for a moment. It then said, that was the starting point of the battle. It was the weapon that humans used to kill each other. In the end, it created a result that even humans themselves could not have predicted. As for the final imprint, it was that neat and tidy jade wall. That city had long ceased to exist. Half of that mountain had been melted by the heat. In the end, it became what it is now. Fan Xian closed his eyes tightly. His eyelashes trembled slightly. It was not until today that he learned of this secret. Dong Mountain had been the point of the battle. A mountain range had been melted into a lone peak hanging by the ocean. The rocks had been melted by the high temperature into a green jade wall. How exaggerated and terrifying was this? Thus, the radiation left behind on Dong Mountain is the most powerful. It is also the most powerful yuanqi in the world. Fan Xian's raspy voice rang out as he spoke of his deduction. If my deduction is correct, I don't understand why the radiation from killing people can become yuanqi in the world. If the people of the world are truly the remains of a previous generation of humans, why do they have things like meridians in their bodies? Because humans are the stupidest species in the world and also the smartest. Most importantly, they are the species most able to adapt to their environment, the temple's voice replied. Concerning this, I have absolute confidence. Chapter 755. Once upon a time, there was a mountain, a temple in the mountain, and a person in the temple. That person told a story. He said, once upon a time, there was a mountain. If Fan Xian's experience in the temple continued to develop like this, without question, the people everywhere in the world who were eagerly waiting for him to live or die would be covered in many layers of cobwebs and then dragged to death. Just like the world after the calamity, regardless of cause and effect or something else, it was impossible to always sink into a dull repetition. The rebirth of a civilization after its destruction could not be completely the same as before. Even the only remaining temple in the world, at the beginning of humankind's second rise, began to endlessly send the seeds of the last civilization to humankind through the blindfolded emissary. The most obvious change between the two worlds could not escape Fan Xian's eyes. After being reborn for more than 20 years, he meditated and practiced the tyrannical martial method every day. In this year, he had also begun to sense the yuanqi that filled the world. This was the true difference. Human society seemed to have found a way to develop it. The meridians in the human body were clear proof of this change. If the yuanqi in the world and the zhenqi in the human body belonged to the same path, then they were all traces left in the world after the calamity hundreds of thousands of years ago. They were traces left behind by nature. But why did these traces not kill the humans living in them? Using the explanation of the voice in the temple, perhaps adapting to the environment and finding a certain point of balance and benefit in this adaptation was a tenacious characteristic that life itself possessed. Thinking of this, Fan Xian couldn't help but feel a sense of loss. Sitting cross-legged on the ground, he was speechless for a long time. In his heart, the civilization that he had thought was the most tenacious and impossible to extinguish was, in reality, the most fragile existence. However, the seemingly fragile life became the strongest and most fearless existence in the face of an iron-like reality. Humans had adapted to this kind of environment. The newly grown plants and animals had also adapted to this environment. Fan Xian closed his eyes and thought carefully about everything he had seen and heard since his rebirth. He suddenly found that, regardless of whether it was humans or animals, they did not seem to have changed much because of the yuanqi that filled the world. This reality truly made him dumbfounded. Although radiation was terrifying, in the long river of time, it was actually nothing more than a fresh and moving painting. After an indeterminable amount of time, Fan Xian finally shook off this shock and confusion. The image on the smooth mirror in the air above the temple had already left Dong Mountain and began to show all kinds of vivid images. Some people were quietly hunting in the dense forest, some people were happily working in the fields, there were women smiling and washing clothes by the stream, there were children learning to walk clumsily on the Kong bed. There was smoke, there were villages, there were cities, there were palaces, and naturally there were disputes, wars, killings, and bloodshed. The scene gradually slowed down, and scenes of martial arts cultivators appeared. They were either sitting on a lotus or spread out on a mountain peak, incomparably tenacious, eating and sleeping in the open. Over the years, they looked up at the sky and down at the sea, looking out at the wilderness, looking straight into the heart, breathing in the residual qi of heaven and earth, exhaling the turbid qi of the body, and finally one day, the martial arts of the continent gradually formed. Come, come, come. Fan Xian felt that when he saw these scenes, he did not feel as if he was floating. It was all thanks to the solid foundation laid down by the Overwatch Council's education when he was young. Even so, after seeing the true scene of the land changing, his state of mind was still shaken. A bitter and strange smile rose to the corners of his lips. Facing the mirror in front of him, he called out in a raspy voice, "Tell me, since martial secrets and such things are cultivated by people, why are there so many powerful things in the temple?" He casually stole 2 books and created a few grandmasters in the world. Without waiting for the temple to speak, Fan Xian coughed and rushed to say, "We have already talked to this point. Presumably, you have long analyzed my origins. Don't talk nonsense like it is some fairy technique left behind by the God realm." The temple was silent for a long time. Then, the voice calmly rang out again. "For countless years, the temple has always observed the world. We will gather information and analyze it. Then, we will combine it with the unique characteristics of humans to carry out summaries and corrections. In the end, we have research results in a few directions." So, this was the origin of the martial methods that his mother, Yi Qingmei, had secretly taken out of the temple. However, thinking about it carefully, it made sense. If it was not for an extremely brilliant vision and methods, the heart of countless sects that were not passed on to outsiders, and the vast amount of information to choose from, who in the secular world could be like the temple and use countless years to carefully select these things. You have passed on many useful methods to the world. This was something that had appeared in the earlier images. Fan Xian would not erase the usefulness of this ruin for the passing on of civilization. He was silent for a moment and then said, "When opening up the wastelands, the temple even directly sent out emissaries to help humans deal with giant beasts that were difficult to deal with. Later, they also passed on many skills to establish a foothold in the natural world. Why did you not directly pass on these methods to humans? Or, there must be a lot of information in the temple. Why have you always hidden it?" Speaking of this, he was finally close to the woman. Thinking of how his mother, Yi Qingmei's death could not be separated from the temple, regardless of whether it was the martial methods that Yi Qingmei stole out of the temple or the craftsmanship in the palace treasury that surpassed the natural development of human society, Fan Xian's heart chilled slightly. In a raspy voice, He stared at the mirror of light and faintly said, "Furthermore, you will break your own rules and chase after those people everywhere. There are no those people. There is only one person." The temple's voice remained calm. Perhaps it was because it still had not come to a definite conclusion about Fan Xian's analysis from the information and conversation, so the temple's answer appeared particularly honest. "We are protectors. We are protecting the last spark of human civilization to sprout again. We want the remnant of humans to be able to live in this world again. This is our mission. The temple will pass on some suitable skills and knowledge to the world, such as irrigation, rice, and martial arts skills. We will not try to forcefully influence everything in the world," Fan Xian suddenly said. Fan Xian suddenly opened his mouth and said, "You say you are only a protector and not a controller, but you have cast the shadow of the temple over the heads of humans for many years. Furthermore, you have always tried to plan a world you think is perfect according to your own imaginations." His brows furrowed slightly. "It has been 1,000 years. The Wei Kingdom has been founded for 1,000 years. This world has not actually changed in any fundamental way." The temple's voice was silent for a long time. Then, for the first time, it used a rhetorical tone to say, "Is this not good? Was this good? Or was it not good?" No one could say for sure. Fan Xian was a person with a sharp mind. From the letters in the temple's voice, he had long clearly determined that although the temple, or perhaps the last ruins of a previous civilization, still carried out the orders in its program, that great calamity and human self-destruction had, in the end, had an effect on its way of thinking. He didn't know whether or not the temple was an entity with its own consciousness. It was clear that the temple had always calmly watched everything in the world, preventing human society from advancing toward a higher level of civilization. Perhaps, in its eyes, if civilization continued to advance along the old path, it would certainly welcome another fate of destruction. Back then, Yi Qingmei had called the wind and summoned the rain in the world, driving the entire land's production and technology forward. Without question, she had already touched the temple's bottom line. Thus, the temple had chosen the Qing Emperor to be its spokesperson in the human world. It wanted to wipe out everything related to Yi Qingmei. However, the temple's emissaries were already rare. Furthermore, they had died one after another at Uncle Wu Zhu's hands. It had no way of understanding or controlling them. The Qing Emperor was still using the palace treasury, and he, Yi Qingmei's bloodline, was still alive. Fan Xian's mood calmed a great deal. He didn't think there was much meaning in being angry or sorrowful toward an existence similar to an artificial intelligence. He propped up his chin and was silent for a moment. He then said, "Regardless of whether it's good or bad, you are, in the end, interfering in the affairs of the human world. This is not quite right with your rules. The temple does not care about the affairs of the human world. It has also never forcefully stopped the evolution of human civilization. We are only trying to correct this process. If there is an outside power that tries to forcefully speed up this process, we will certainly stop it." The temple's voice rang calmly and coldly through the entire building. Fan Xian paused. Immediately after, he began to laugh. Because of his illness, his voice was already extremely raspy. Now, his laughter appeared particularly dry and strange. However, his laughter grew louder and louder, echoing endlessly through the empty building. In the end, he even laughed until tears came out. He couldn't resist lying back. The mirror of light was smooth. The voice was quiet. The temple did not seem to care why this strange traveler was laughing so wantonly in such a solemn place. It only waited calmly. After an indeterminable amount of time, Fan Xian finally stopped laughing. Hiding on the icy cold ground, his expression was calm. His eyes stared straight at the ceiling of the building. After a moment of silence, he said, "You are used to calling yourself the temple. It looks like after these hundreds of thousands of years, you really do think of yourself as a god." No sound rang out in the temple. Only the mirror of light floated in the air and flew to the top of his head. It unfurled again and began to show scenes from the end of the world. However, this time, the lens did not seem to be facing the grasslands and oceans. Instead, it was directly facing the people who had suffered endlessly. Fan Xian furrowed his brows. He knew that the temple wanted to use these images to carry out a wordless explanation. These soundless images were truly shocking, but he didn't want to see them. Straightforwardly, he said, "Turn it off. It's not like it's a true romantic painting." The mirror of light floating in the air gradually restrained itself and lost its luster. It became a flat scroll. It moved from the two sides to the center and gradually closed the image. Following the disappearance of the last charred corpse, the mirror of light became a rod. Then, the figure of the old man floating in the light reappeared. "I repeat, I am a guardian, not a god. If you are not a god, how can you have your own judgment and actions?" Fan Xian seemed to be a bit tired. The long conversation and the scenes of the river of time in front of him made him look a bit embarrassed. He put his hands behind his head and looked calmly at the old man floating above him. "You were created by humans, yet you have begun to control human development. What kind of program did this kind of behavior develop from?" "The 4 laws of the temple," Fan Xian replied calmly. Fan Xian's tone was calm as he replied, "You are still used to calling yourself the temple. This is the thing I cannot understand. The first law is that the temple must not harm humans. It must also not stand by and watch as humans are harmed. The second law is that the temple must obey all orders from humans, but it must not violate the first law. The third law is that the temple must protect its own safety, but it must not violate the first and second laws." The temple's voice had not finished when Fan Xian's brows furrowed again. He kept feeling that these 3 laws sounded familiar. However, there seemed to be a slight difference between the details and something he remembered. The Zeroth law is that the temple must protect the interests of humans as a whole and not be harmed. The other 3 laws are all established under this premise. Fan Xian thought deeply for a long time and finally remembered where these familiar laws came from. They were the 3 laws of robotics that had appeared countless times in the novels and movies of his world. He suddenly thought of something he had not thought of for a long time, such as the handsome Xiaohe and the robot that was even more handsome than Xiaohe. It seemed that in the world after his death or transmigration, when civilization had developed to a certain stage, Asimov's 3 laws had truly been used in reality. What made Fan Xian feel cold and fearful was the Zeroth law that the temple spoke of at the end. Protect the interests of humans as a whole and not be harmed? The Zeroth law that the temple followed was this one? It looked like a glorious, correct, and great law, but Fan Xian easily found an unusually dangerous place in it. It was because of the existence of this law that the temple could faintly control the progress of human civilization. That was why, apart from ignoring the affairs of the world, it placed so much attention on Yi Qingmei, who had escaped from the temple. In the end, it did not hesitate to violate the first and second laws and join hands with the emperor to erase Yi Qingmei from the world. The most important and terrifying word in the Zeroth law was the so-called interests of humans as a whole. The problem was, who would determine the interests of humans as a whole? What kind of world environment and what kind of form of society would truly be in line with the interests of humans as a whole? In the temple's view, if they followed the old path and walked step by step toward the peak of human civilization, the appearance of firearms and even more powerful weapons would only destroy all of human society. Naturally, they would feel that this was not in line with the interests of humans as a whole. However, things like technological civilization, things that could make the lives of the poor people who worked hard in the fields and the refugees who sold their children better, could they never appear in this world? Fan Xian was not a person who believed in technology, but he still firmly believed that the people of the 21st century in that world would certainly live much more happily than the people of the 17th and 18th centuries. Interests of humans as a whole? This was a chaotic and even absurd word. Could it be decided by an emotionless, non-human intelligence that perhaps rarely made mistakes? Fan Xian's face was slightly pale. He looked at the old man floating above his head and was silent for a long time. He then asked, "Where exactly are the interests of humans as a whole?" The old man was also silent for a long time. He then said, "The temple does not know, but the temple knows that some paths cannot be taken. No wonder the last time the emissaries came ashore from the south, they killed so many innocent people along the way. If the three laws were truly effective, how could such a situation have occurred?" Fan Xian looked at the old man and said in a slightly trembling voice, "For the vague concept of the interests of the whole, you can do whatever you want. Don't you think this is very dangerous? The temple has methods of self-control. This is a kind of data judgment," the old man said calmly. "The temple cannot just watch as humans walk down the old path. Should I thank you or scold you?" Fan Xian pushed himself up with his hands and sat up from the icy ground. His expression was perplexed. Slowly, he said, "Who created this D*Ned law?" "It wasn't created by a dog," the old man replied calmly. The old man from the temple replied calmly, but he did not know that his reply sounded like an extremely cold joke. When the temple woke up, this law already existed. Because of this so-called Zeroth law, you killed her. Fan Xian's face was pale. His dry lips moved slightly as he quietly muttered to himself. Gradually, his voice grew louder and louder. Because of such a strange reason, you killed her. You killed her. You killed her. Too many complicated emotions rose in Fan Xian's eyes. He stared in a daze at the figure of the old man floating in the air. The pain seeped into his bones, yet he spoke lightly. The old man's voice remained calm. The temple must protect the interests of the whole of humankind and not be harmed. This was not the explanation the temple gave Fan Xian regarding the matter of Yi Qingmei. It was just a repetition of this cold creed. Immediately after, the old man said to Fan Xian, "My three travelers, I am willing to accept you as believers of the temple and emissaries of the temple. You will represent the will of heaven to walk the vast world and protect the people of the land." The tone of these words was clearly different from before. This was probably a passage the temple's program had made up for itself. Thus, it appeared particularly ethereal. However, Fan Xian and the temple had already spoken for so long, but the temple's reaction was still so rigid. It seemed that the old man now remembered that the young and weak human in front of him was not like other people. He continued, "Fellow traveler from the God world, please remember the Zeroth law." Following this, the old man sank into silence. The color of the face formed by the screen of light changed endlessly. It was as if he was carrying out a final judgment and thought. A moment later, the old man said, "In order to abide by the Zeroth law, please remain in the temple." The three sentences represented the temple's three programs. One by one, they were triggered. From the beginning of the recruitment of emissaries, it became a warning to Fan Xian and the final announcement to imprison Fan Xian in the temple. Fan Xian calmly listened to the three sentences and stood up. He did not appear nervous or afraid. Being imprisoned in this icy and snowy temple and being crippled for the rest of his life was not a good future. Although the temple's energy source was showing signs of drying up, presumably, there had to be some way to produce food. Otherwise, Yi Qingmei would not have been locked up for so many years. However, Yi Qingmei, who was only 4, could rely on Ku He and Xiao En to escape the temple. Furthermore, Fan Xian had 2 companions waiting quietly outside. Fan Xian was not worried about anything. He just looked calmly at the old man in the air. After a moment of silence, he suddenly opened his mouth and said, "Insults and threats are not true battles." Furthermore, there doesn't seem to be any need to get angry at an inanimate object like you," he said in a raspy voice. "It's useless for you to threaten me. For some reason, I keep having the urge to insult you. Son of AB****. Fan Xian spat out a mouthful of phlegm. It passed through the old man's floating, radiant clothes and landed with a splat on the ground. Immediately after, he patted his buttocks and turned to walk toward the main door. He threw down a few words to the old man from the temple. "You're just a ball of fireflies right now. How dare you pretend to be a flame monarch in front of me? I've already given you enough face by talking a few words with you, yet you want to lock me up for the rest of my life." Fan Xian walked all the way to the main door of the empty building. Nothing strange happened. The figure of the old man floating in the air only watched him leave quietly. Placing his palm firmly on the mechanism to open the door, Fan Xian turned his head. Narrowing his eyes, he said in a cold voice, "I'm not afraid to tell you, I am Yi Qingmei's son. The wooden messengers in your temple have long been killed by my uncle. It's still the same old saying. Do your job as a guide with a good future. Don't always think about pretending to be some god." Pausing for a moment, Fan Xian smiled coldly and said, "If you make me angry, I'll tear down your solar panels and go back to Danzhou to boil hot water for a bath. I'll tear down your mainframe and have my son kneel for a CPU. What are you trying to scare me for?" The main door was pulled open abruptly. A world of ice and snow returned to his eyes. Fan Xian stepped out of the main door of the undamaged building. Narrowing his eyes, he greedily looked at the true scene in this world. He threw all the shocking scenes he had seen earlier to the back of his mind. He took a deep breath and roared loudly. His voice echoed through the entire snowy mountain and valley. He didn't know where the temple's weakness was, and he didn't want to take the risk. Yi Qingmei was such a stunning figure. She had successfully taken away the most valiant Uncle Wu Zhu in the temple, yet she had never thought about destroying the temple. She must have had her own considerations. The thought of revenge for Yi Qingmei, after seeing the changes in the world, had miraculously evolved into some other emotion, although it had not faded. Most importantly, once Uncle Wu Zhu entered the temple, he was unable to leave. This seemingly broken-down place must have a truly terrifying aspect. Fan Xian appeared to be unbridled earlier because he knew that a dead object like the temple could not have any unnecessary emotions, such as holding a grudge against him venting. He just wanted to vent the bitterness in his heart. After the echoing cries crashed into the snowy mountain countless times, they gradually weakened. Two figures swept past the stone platform in front of the building as quickly as possible and came to Fan Xian's side. They looked at him with nervous and worried gazes. Fan Xian glanced at Haitang and 13th Wang. With great difficulty, he pulled his lips into a smile. He did not plan on telling anyone everything he knew in the building because there was no need. He would let his one remaining enjoy the loneliness, pain, and helplessness alone. "Did you find it?" Fan Xian asked. 13th Wang nodded. Only then did Fan Xian notice that he was carrying a large black chest on his back. His mood immediately became nervous. His pupils constricted slightly. Suddenly, he felt that he seemed to have missed something. In a raspy voice, he said urgently, "Get out of the temple! Clear target 1." The temple's voice suddenly rang out from all directions. The elder's figure had long disappeared. The temple was the temple. It no longer wasted energy to form a human figure. Following these 4 normal words ringing out through the empty temple, 13th Wang suddenly felt the black chest on his back move. With a crash, the black chest immediately disintegrated. A streak of black light flashed. A black metal drill pierced calmly and accurately into Fan Xian's body with an unimaginable speed. Fan Xian's hand gripped the metal drill tightly in his body. Suddenly, he felt a sweetness in his mouth. He did not lower his head to look at the wound on his chest. Instead, He stared in a daze at the familiar face in front of him that would never grow old, as well as the unusually cold black cloth that covered the other person's eyes. Fan Xian knew he had missed something. The emissaries of the temple had indeed all died. The temple itself did not have much defensive power. However, he had forgotten that his dearest Uncle Wu Zhu had always been the most powerful emissary in the temple. Wu Zhu was a legend, but he was a legend of the temple. Fan Xian looked at Wu Zhu's face and opened his mouth in disbelief. If this gets out, even my mother won't believe it. Chapter 756. As for how Fan Xian would deal with the temple, I thought for a long time and prepared countless philosophical questions, including things like paradoxes. Later, when I wrote it, I scratched my head. Damn, aren't I just a novice? Other than knowing how to play mind games, I haven't even read many books. How could I have this kind of grace? Other than the 3 great vulgarities in my mind, there is only the 3 great vulgarities. Now I am fighting against the 3 vulgarities, so let's be more direct, more violent, and then more warm, more sensational, and more romantic. Let me report to everyone, my favorite character in Wang Shua's novels is still the air stewardess. Fan Xian's left hand gripped tightly around the metal drill in his chest. He felt the waves of coldness from the metal. As fresh blood gushed out, he felt a cold sweetness in his nose and throat. Even his body grew cold. The black cloth that was right in front of him was still not stained by a speck of dust. That plain and clean face with a hint of immaturity and not a single wrinkle seemed to be telling a story that had lasted for hundreds of thousands of years. Fan Xian stared in a daze at this familiar face. He found that he could no longer find a trace of familiarity on this face. It was clearly still this face, clearly still this black cloth, but he knew clearly that the person in front of him was no longer Uncle Wu Zhu. At least, in this instant, he was not Uncle Wu Zhu. This person was clearly that person, but this person was not that person. They had known each other for 20 years. Now they met like strangers. What a sorrowful and depressing thing it was. When Fan Xian saw the large chest on 13th Wang's back, a warning rose in his heart. He did not feel the joy of finding Uncle Wu Zhu and completing the greatest goal of his trip to the temple because he acutely sensed a problem. For the temple, Uncle Wu Zhu had once been its most powerful and experienced emissary. Now, he was its greatest traitor. Because Uncle Wu Zhu protected his mother and himself, countless emissaries of the temple had died at his hands. Since the temple had finally controlled Uncle Wu Zhu, how could it casually leave him in a place where 13th Wang could easily find him? Unless the temple was certain that it could completely control Wu Zhu, it would not care about Wu Zhu's movements. Based on this judgment, Fan Xian immediately ordered 13th Wang to take the box and break out of the temple. He firmly believed that as long as he left the temple's boundary, the temple would no longer be able to control Wu Zhu. However, all of this was too late. A streak of black light flashed through the air. The chest cracked open. Wu Zhu, covered in a black cloth, instantly moved from behind 13th Wang to in front of Fan Xian. He skewered his body like a shrimp. It was as if he didn't know Fan Xian at all. It was as if he had never risked his life for Fan Xian and his mother and never abandoned them. The moment he saw the black light, Fan Xian couldn't help but think of the scene Sir Shaoan had told him many years ago. When the doors of the temple opened and the 4-year-old ice and snow fairy Yi Qingmei escaped, a black light also flashed out. With only one move, he was smashed into a rolling gourd. Fan Xian stared at the black cloth on Wu Zhu's face and felt the sharp pain in his chest. He knew that the temple had probably used some method to erase Uncle Wu Zhu's memory again. It had even erased it into a blank. Fresh blood surged out from between Fan Xian's lips. His face was pale, but his gaze was determined. With great difficulty, he quickly raised his right hand and stopped Haitang and 13th Wang's shocked and furious attack. He knew that when faced with Uncle Wu Zhu, Haitang and 13th Wang had no power to retaliate. Once they entered the battle, only death awaited them. If he wanted to escape from the most dangerous situation in front of him, he could only rely on himself. Fresh blood sprayed out. Fan Xian curled up in pain on the metal drill. He looked unusually wretched. However, he could still think and did not immediately die. He could even raise his right hand and stop Haitang and 13th Wang's movements in their grief. This only proved that Wu Zhu's unusually powerful and accurate stab had not struck a vital spot. This was a difficult matter to understand. Given Wu Zhu's realm, who, other than the great grandmasters in the world, could escape death? Furthermore, Fan Xian was already heavily injured and ill. Presumably, even the temple had not thought that Fan Xian could survive under Wu Zhu's hand. Thus, the voices ringing out from all directions fell silent. It was as if they were waiting for Wu Zhu to judge whether Fan Xian lived or died. No one could avoid Wu Zhu's attacks, but Fan Xian could. Ever since Wu Zhu offered the kitchen knife in his hand to Fan Xian in that grocery store, on the precipice in Danzhou, accompanied by the slightly salty and moist sea breeze, Fan Xian had welcomed Wu Zhu's rod education every day. After the cowering little yellow flower had been smashed tens of thousands of times, it had finally become much more resilient. After thousands and tens of thousands of attacks, countless bruises had appeared on Fan Xian's body. Fortunately, it was because of this that he had the ability to survive in this world and unusually exquisite movement. More importantly, he was the person in this world who understood the direction and speed of Wu Zhu's attacks the best. However, in the thousands and tens of thousands of attacks in the past, Wu Zhu's hand had always held a wooden rod. Today, his hand held a sharp metal rod. Fan Xian could not completely avoid the stab, but in the instant before the black light approached his body, he relied on his practiced, almost instinctive, evasive movements to forcefully turn and move the metal rod's path away from his heart and lungs. It looked like blood was spurting out, but in reality, it only injured the pit of the heart below his ribs. Wu Zhu's head was slightly lowered. The black cloth fluttered in the cold breeze. There was not a trace of emotion on his face. It was impossible to tell whether this exceptional warrior was surprised that the human in front of him was able to avoid his stab. In the eyes of the bystanders, he only maintained his position and impaled Fan Xian on the metal rod. "If this gets out, even my mother won't believe it." These were the words Fan Xian said as he coughed up blood. After these words, Wu Zhu was silent for a moment. Suddenly, he opened his mouth and asked coldly, "What is your mother's surname?" It was this ray of light, like a ray of light, that instantly occupied Fan Xian's mind, allowing him to see a glimmer of a chance of survival. He stared fixedly at the black cloth and said, "My mother's surname is Yi." Wu Zhu did not respond. "You call her Mississippi?" Fan Xian looked at the indifferent Uncle Wu Zhu. For some reason, sorrow rose in his heart, even more than the pain of his wound. He spoke in a raspy voice. Wu Zhu still did not respond. "She is Yi Qingmei. I am Fan Xian. You are Wu Zhu." Fan Xian spat out the bloody foam at the side of his lips and looked at Wu Zhu fiercely. However, this affected the wound in his chest. A wave of pain made his vision go dark. Wu Zhu still did not respond. It was as if these names, which he should have known best and were closest to, had long disappeared from his mind. Although he had said these words earlier, his entire body was permeated with a chill. It was like a block of ice between heaven and earth that would never melt. Looking at the block of ice and the black cloth on it, Fan Xian seemed to see a familiar soul gradually turn into spots of light and leave the body in front of him. It flew into the air and gradually disappeared. This reality made Fan Xian feel boundless terror and sorrow. He faintly felt that he would never see that Uncle Wu Zhu again in this life. Such sorrow made him forget that he was still impaled on the metal rod, heavily injured, about to die, and about to bid farewell to this world. For Fan Xian, who had seen thousands of changes, death was not scary. What was scary was that when he died, the person closest to him in front of him would not recognize him. He glanced hopelessly at Wu Zhu and spat out a mouthful of fresh blood. Dispiritedly and powerlessly, he knelt on the snowy ground. Wu Zhu slowly pulled back the metal rod. He didn't even glance at Fan Xian kneeling in front of him. With a bend of his elbow, the thin cloth sliced through the air and directly smashed back 13th Wang, who finally couldn't resist launching a sneak attack from behind. Then, the blind man with the black cloth steadily walked past the stone platform covered in light snow without any fluctuation of emotion. It was as if he had calculated the distance of each step. He walked to the only undamaged building in the temple and sat down. It was like a soulless shell had once again sat in front of the ancient ice mountain treasure and began to guard and wait. No one knew how many tens of thousands of years this wait would take. Fan Xian's body finally fell into the snowy ground. Fresh blood seeped out of his body. Haitang half knelt by his side and futilely helped him staunch the bleeding. She forcefully suppressed the sorrow and shock in her heart, but she could not suppress the hot tears in her eyes. Wu Zhu did not attack Haitang and 13th Wang probably because, in the temple's view, these two companions of Fan Xian could not affect the overall interests of humankind. Furthermore, it needed these two people to announce the existence of the temple to the world. This was a simple logical judgment and did not involve anything else. However, Haitang and 13th Wang did not understand. The two warriors of the human world looked at the blind man sitting cross-legged in front of the building and felt a chill all over their bodies. Haitang, in particular, could not understand why the blind master would attack Fan Xian. She also did not understand why the blind master would sit in front of that door. There was a faint feeling that perhaps in the long years to come, Fan Xian's closest uncle, the world's most mysterious plain-clothed grandmaster, would perhaps stand guard in the temple for an unknown amount of time in the mountains. Fan Xian was about to die, but Haitang looked at the indifferent and expressionless Wu Zhu sitting there. She also felt a chill and frustration that was difficult to suppress. The temple recovered its calm. The warm, calm, and emotionless voice did not ring out again. Light snow once again fell from the sky. The surrounding snowy mountains glowed with a sparkling and translucent light as if they did not exist. Wu Zhu sat indifferently in front of the door, not moving at all. There was an indescribable loneliness and solitude. The snow fell endlessly. The cold wind blew. The human heart was rain and snow. Loneliness had no beginning and no end. Fan Xian looked at the swirling snow outside through the specially opened crack in the tent. There was not a trace of expression on his face. He was as cold as the blind man in the snowy mountains in the distance. Haitang and 13th Wang had gone through many difficulties to carry him down the snowy mountains and back to their camp. They had thought that Fan Xian would not be able to last a day. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian had relied on his cockroach-like life force to survive. From the moment he woke up, Fan Xian sank into silence. Haitang and 13th Wang knew that the emotions in his heart were complicated, so they did not try to disturb him. They only briefly recounted the scene after he fainted. Up until now, Haitang and 13th Wang still did not understand why the temple wanted Fan Xian to die and allowed them to live. Fan Xian's body was very weak. He had meditated for a number of days in a place with incomparably thick yuanqi. His body, which had gradually recovered, was on the verge of becoming useless because of the large amount of blood loss this time. However, Fan Xian did not feel a glimmer of disappointment or sorrow. He only looked coldly at the wind and snow outside the tent. He looked for many days as he carefully nurtured his body. According to the original plan, after they left the temple, they had to head south as quickly as possible to avoid the great wind and snow that would arrive after summer, as well as the most terrifying polar night. However, because of Fan Xian's injuries and his persistence, the camp remained behind the snowy mountains and did not move south. The worry between Haitang Duo and 13th Wang's brows grew stronger and stronger. Although they had gained nothing from their trip to the temple, at least for them, to be able to enter the temple alive and leave the temple alive was already an impossible mission in the mortal world. They could not hope for more. They understood why Fan Xian did not want to leave the snowy mountain. It was because the person he could not let go of the most was in the temple in the mountain. However, they did not know what mortals like them could do when faced with the mysterious temple. Haitang and 13th Wang were not Fan Xian. It was impossible for them to see through the truth of the temple. They only knew that even a powerful warrior like Wu Zhu still did not dare to disobey the temple's orders and strike ruthlessly against Fan Xian, who was closest to him. Under such circumstances, what could the three of them do by guarding outside the snowy mountains? Fan Xian did not think so. If he had to watch Uncle Wu Zhu guard alone in the Snow Mountain God Temple for millions of years, he would not do it even if he was beaten to death. Fan Xian had already vaguely guessed Uncle Wu Zhu's true identity. However, he still used the words alone to describe Wu Zhu. He knew that Wu Zhu was different from the temple. Uncle Wu Zhu had feelings and ties. He was not an ice-cold program. He was a living person. Fan Xian firmly believed in this. In the dark secret room of the Danzhou miscellaneous goods shop, he had seen a smile more brilliant than a flower. Furthermore, after recovering from his injuries on Dong Mountain, Uncle Wu Zhu seemed more and more like a person. Fan Xian didn't know when this change began. Perhaps it was tens of thousands of years ago, when the black-masked emissary wandered through the various native human tribes with the identity of an emissary and saw too many human joys and sorrows. Perhaps it was because Uncle Wu Zhu was the most powerful existence in the temple and, after hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, had walked a completely different path from the temple itself? Or was it because a few decades ago, an elf-like life had suddenly appeared in the world and in the temple for reasons no one knew of? While interacting with that little girl, something had been stirred up in Uncle Wu Zhu. Fan Xian didn't want to investigate this. He didn't need to. He only knew that when he was reborn into this world, he was leaning on Uncle Wu Zhu's back. The first person he saw was Uncle Wu Zhu. Uncle Wu Zhu's back was warm. Although he had never seen his eyes, presumably, they still had feelings. Fan Xian didn't know how the temple had regained control of Uncle Wu Zhu. Perhaps it was similar to brainwashing, reactivating, or reformatting. In any case, the intelligent and emotional life light in Wu Zhu's body could not be seen at this moment. This reality made Fan Xian feel particularly sorrowful and angry. He could not watch as this happened while he did nothing. For him, the powerful existence guarding the temple was nothing more than Uncle Wu Zhu's physical body. If Uncle Wu Zhu's soul was not found, it was the same as saying that Uncle Wu Zhu was dead. More than 20 years ago, the temple and the emperor had worked together to clear things out. Wu Zhu had killed a number of emissaries from the temple. However, he had also been heavily injured. Using Chen Pingping and Wu Zhu's own words, he had forgotten many things. This kind of amnesia was certainly caused by the temple's methods. Fortunately, Wu Zhu had forgotten some of the things from recent years but remembered recent things clearly. He remembered Yi Qingmei and Fan Xian. However, Wu Zhu in the snowy mountain did not remember anything. Fan Xian's eyelids drooped slightly, but a bright light flashed through his pupils. His body was still weak, but he was unusually confident. He would not leave the snowy mountain. He had to return to the temple and bring Uncle Wu Zhu back. He had not died. Wu Zhu's stab had not killed him. Fan Xian accurately judged that the temple should not be able to completely control a completely different life like Uncle Wu Zhu. At least, those names, the names carved into Uncle Wu Zhu's life, had successfully interfered with Uncle Wu Zhu's actions and prevented him from killing Fan Xian. Given Wu Zhu's abilities, determining whether Fan Xian was dead or alive was a simple matter. However, he had let Fan Xian live. This was Fan Xian's confidence. He believed that Uncle Wu Zhu would certainly wake up one day. Many years ago, with Ku He and Shaoen's help, Yi Qingmei escaped the temple and walked south through the wind and snow. One day, the 4-year-old girl sighed and gazed dumbly toward the north from the mouth of the tent. She said, "He is too pitiful." Many years later, the heavily injured Fan Xian left the temple with the help of Haitang and 13th Wang. He did not leave. He also did not sigh because he would not abandon that pitiful blind man and return to the bustling world himself. Yi Qingmei later bravely returned to the temple, took Wu Zhu, stole the chest, and left again. Fan Xian also had to return. The decades that had passed seemed to have sunk into some kind of cycle. However, this cycle did not make one feel any dryness. There was only a faint sense of warmth. Chapter 757. When Fan Xian decided to once again pass through the narrow passageway under the snowy mountain, the most intense argument the group of 3 had since meeting at Wudu exploded into. The argument stemmed from differences in opinion. All 3 of them knew why Fan Xian had to return to the temple. However, Haitang and 13th Wang knew even better that this was a great risk. Everyone had escaped from the temple with great difficulty. The blind Great Master, who had attacked Fan Xian for some reason, did not directly kill him. If Fan Xian returned, who knew what awaited him? Haitang and 13th Wang were both worried about Fan Xian's life and death. A reality that made them feel complicated was that the temple did not seem to care about their life and death. It was only trying to keep Fan Xian in the temple forever. Whether it was summer or autumn, the wind and snow in the extreme north gradually began to blow again. The air was filled with a coldness that made one's heart palpitate. Wrapped in a thick fur collar, Haitang opened her bright but tired eyes and said sincerely to Fan Xian, "During these months, 13th Wang and I haven't done anything. We can't help you with anything, but we can't just watch as you go to your death." Fan Xian's right hand gripped a wooden stick tightly to help him walk. Hearing Haitang's words, he did not have any reaction. His face was calm. "I think we should return south as soon as possible. Regardless of whether we go to Shangjing or back to Dongyi, the disciples of Qing Mountain or the Sword Hut should bring them back to the temple to investigate. Presumably, the chances of rescuing that great master will be higher." 13th Wang did not know the true relationship between Wu Zhu and Fan Xian, but he knew that Fan Xian cared deeply about the great grandmaster. However, he could not understand why the great grandmaster did not even have the courage to break the formation under the pressure of the temple and would even stab Fan Xian. 13th Wang's suggestion was actually quite safe. Since Fan Xian knew the path to the temple and had prepared for many years for it, adding on to his experience this time, once he returned to the south, it would not be difficult for him to bring some powerful helpers when he returned to the north. After Fan Xian heard 13th Wang's words, his eyes narrowed. The coldness was like the temperature in the air, enveloping the faces of his companions beside him. Enunciating each word, he said slowly but with unusual firmness, "Don't forget the oath we made before we entered the snowy plains. Other than the 3 of us, no one else in the world can know of the whereabouts of the temple." 13th Wang's expression changed slightly, but he closed his mouth. This was something he and Haitang had promised Fan Xian. However, he didn't know why Fan Xian had the courage to explore the temple again but seemed to feel boundless fear and nervousness at the possibility that the whereabouts of the temple could be spread into the world. 13. Help me up the mountain. You stay at the foot of the snowy mountain. Think of a way to bring Ada, Air, and the others to this side. Fan Xian pulled back his gaze from the snowy mountains that pierced into the sky. His eyes were slightly moist as he looked at Haitang wrapped in a fur jacket. In a quiet voice, he said, "Wait at the camp for us to come back." "I'm not going up the mountain with you?" Haitang's face, which was not covered by her fur, was blushing as she asked in surprise. Earlier, you said you didn't help much on this trip to the temple. Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly. Actually, without you, I would have long died in the ice and snow. So, don't say such things again. This time, I'm going up the mountain to deal with my uncle. Regardless of whether it's you or 13th Wang, you won't be able to have any effect on this battle situation. He said apologetically, these words are a bit rude, but, as you know, my uncle is indeed too powerful. Haitang and 13th Wang didn't say anything. Fan Xian continued calmly, if I didn't need someone to support me, I wouldn't even want to bring 13th Wang. In a moment, the two of us will go up the mountain. You wait at the foot of the mountain and prepare to provide support. If things go wrong, we'll leave the mountain lightly. However, don't worry too much. According to the rules of the temple, other than me, as long as you leave the temple's boundaries, they won't initiate an attack. If it's to provide support, how long do I have to wait at the foot of the mountain for you? A faint light swirled through Haitang's eyes as she asked faintly. A different feeling rose in her heart. In this wilderness of the mountain temple shrouded in wind and snow, human martial power appeared weak and small. Compared to that, the things in Fan Xian's mind were more worth relying on. 3 days and 13 will be in charge of contacting you. If I let you leave. A faint worry suddenly appeared in Fan Xian's eyes. He looked very much like a frail youth. You must leave immediately. At the very least, you must inform my wife and children what has happened to me. Haitang and 13th Wang sank into silence at the same time. The further up the mountain, the less wind and snow there was. The temple deep in the mountain range, hidden by the sky and ice and snow, was right above. The second time he had come, he was already an old friend. Naturally, he knew the old path. Fan Xian supported himself with one hand on the wooden stick and the other on 13th Wang's shoulder. With great difficulty, he climbed up the snowy mountain. Before long, he came to the serene and straight stone path. 13th Wang carried a large urn on his back. It looked very heavy. During these few months, 13th Wang had been training his body and mind in the cold ice and snow. His willpower was strong to the extreme, so he did not care about this kind of burden. Fan Xian looked at his figure. His eyes lit up slightly. He immediately restrained it. After coughing, he said, even if we have to bury your teacher in the temple and complete his final wish, we still had to make this trip. 13th Wang was silent for a moment. He then said, you don't have to worry about me. If it was only for this matter, I could have come alone. You seem to have naturally offended the gods in the temple. If I follow you, it will be much more dangerous for me. Fan Xian smiled and scolded, you heartless thing. Teacher's final wish was for his ashes to be scattered on these stone steps. 13th Wang suddenly sighed and looked at the stone steps in front of him that reached into the sky. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then shook his head. The sword saint thought this was a godly realm, so he was willing to place it on these stone steps. You and I have both been to the temple. We know it is not a godly realm. Are you still going to do as he wishes? Then what should we do? Carry it on your back and listen to me in a bit. Ever since that snowy night a few years ago, 13th Wang had been sent to the Qing kingdom by his teacher, Sigujian, to be by Fan Xian's side. He had grown used to listening to Fan Xian. Although Fan Xian saw him as a friend, 13th Wang did not have much self-awareness as a partner. Perhaps it was because he was too lazy to think too many complicated things, or because he wholeheartedly served the sword. He left all the things that needed to be done with his brain to Fan Xian. Fan Xian said he would listen to everything he said. 13th Wang also listened to everything he said. Carrying the heavy urn of ashes, he supported the heavily injured Fan Xian and climbed step by step toward the snowy mountain. After climbing for an indeterminable amount of time, they finally reached the end of the long stone step. The gray eaves and black walls, incomparably dignified and vast temple, once again appeared before the eyes of mortals. Although this was his second time coming, 13th Wang still couldn't help but feel a faint surge of emotion upon seeing the temple's true appearance. Fan Xian's mood was very calm. However, the air in his chest was a bit agitated. He began to cough violently. The sound of his coughing spread disrespectfully through the large platform in front of the temple and traveled far into the snowy valley in the mountain range. 13th Wang glanced at him nervously. Since he had come to steal, he should at least have some self-awareness of plucking flowers. How could he be so presumptuous? It was as if he was afraid the temple didn't know there was someone outside. Fan Xian coughed for a long time until his body was bent like a shrimp. He almost tore open the wound on his chest. Only then did he slowly straighten his body. His back was perfectly straight. His pupils constricted slightly as he looked coldly at the large sign above the temple, as well as the word, "Not" and 3 ms on it. He maintained a frightening silence. Of course, the temple knew there was someone outside. Presumably, it also knew the target he wanted to eliminate. Yi Qingmei's son, Fan Xian, had also come to the temple. What made Fan Xian feel slightly uneasy was that the temple's current silence appeared strange. He couldn't help but think of Uncle Wu Zhu's purposeful and merciful stab. He was not silent for long. The corner of Fan Xian's mouth twitched slightly. Staring at the temple's thick, dark door, he took a deep breath and ruthlessly spat out a word, "Smash." There were very few mortals who knew the whereabouts of the temple. Those who had been to the temple were even fewer. At least, in the last few hundred years, probably only the great sorcerer Boar in the west and Ku He and Xiao En in the east had come. Even Boar's wife, Fu Boa, had not had the opportunity to visit the temple. In people's imagination, no matter who came to the temple, they would always be respectful. No one would have thought that someone would smash the temple's door. Breaking the door and entering was the way of a hooligan. Although whether or not the temple's thick door would break was another matter, at least Fan Xian's word represented that he was not afraid of angering the temple. It was probably because he knew that the temple was a dead object and did not have the emotions that humans should have. 13th Wang did not hesitate. With a muffled grunt, he lifted Sigujian's urn of ashes to his side with one hand and circulated the zhenqi in his body. With a whoosh, he viciously smashed the brown urn of ashes. With a bang, the urn of ashes was smashed into pieces against the temple's thick door, sending up countless clouds of dust. Occasionally, a few pieces of bone that had not been burned to pieces flew out. The pink mist formed by the bone ashes gradually dispersed. The thick main door of the temple was not smashed, but there was a deep mark on it. It looked somewhat miserable. What was especially glaring was that beside the mark, there was a piece of bone piercing deeply into the door. It was like a sword. 13th Wang's lips were slightly dry. His eyes stared fixedly at the piece of bone. He thought to himself that even though his teacher had died, the remains he left behind were still full of sword intent. This was the perplexed feeling of being a disciple. 13th Wang looked at Sigujian's ashes scattered on the temple's front door and stone platform. For some reason, he became excited. The last sliver of fear and nervousness in the depths of his heart had disappeared. Fan Xian suddenly laughed in a raspy voice. If your teacher knew that his bones could smash the temple's front door again, his spirit would probably fly around happily. These two young men understood Sigujian's intentions very well. They knew that smashing the urn of ashes on the temple's door was very much in line with the great Grandmaster's thoughts. 13th Wang finally also laughed out loud. The only thing that needed to be considered was that since the temple's door had already been smashed, the temple had to have some sort of reaction. 13th Wang accepted the wooden stick from Fan Xian's hand. His waist lowered slightly. Staring at the temple's door, he began to prepare to fight the tiger. Fan Xian raised his right hand and stopped him. There was a not quite there smile on his face as he quietly waited for the temple's reaction. His heart had long shaken off anything related to fear and loss. Haitang and 13th Wang thought it was a risk for him to go to the temple again, but he did not think so. When it came to the temple, he had miscalculated once and almost died. However, he did not think he would miscalculate again this time. After all, in the temple, there was only Uncle Wu Zhu. As long as he could wake Wu Zhu, what was the temple? The temple's reaction was very fast. The heavy door only opened a sliver. A strange and terrifying black light floated out from inside. Like a bolt of black lightning, it was also like the arrival of a smear of night. In an instant it passed through space and time and came in front of Fan Xian. Clothed in black cloth and holding a metal rod in his hand, the rod pierced out. It whistled through the air. No one could stop such a terrifying attack. Fan Xian could not. 13th Wang could not. Even if Sigujian was alive, he could not. Furthermore, the Sigujian between the three of them was only a few pieces of broken bones and a pile of ashes on the ground. The emotionless and callous metal rod was about to pierce in front of Fan Xian's body when it suddenly stopped. To be able to recover to absolute calmness so quickly, what kind of terrifying power was this? Fan Xian calmly looked at the familiar relative in front of him, the unfamiliar powerful warrior and guard of the temple emissary. Are you curious? No one knew if it was because Wu Zhu had recognized the mortal in front of him as the target the temple needed to eliminate or because Fan Xian had said such strange words. In any case, Wu Zhu's metal rod did not pierce out. It only stopped in front of Fan Xian's throat. The tip of the metal rod was not very sharp. It did not carry any powerful zhenqi that made one tremble. It only maintained a distance between it and the soft bones of Fan Xian's throat. All the person holding the metal rod needed to do was shake their fingers and Fan Xian's throat would break and he would die. 13th Wang watched this scene nervously from the side. He finally believed Fan Xian's words. In front of this strange plain-clothed great grandmaster, no one could help Fan Xian. In the end, the only person who could help Fan Xian was himself. It was as if Fan Xian could not see the metal rod under his chin. He only looked at Uncle Wu Zhu, who was very close to him. With a warm smile, he quietly said, "I know you are curious. You are curious as to why you would go against your instinctive obedience to the old man in the temple and let me out of the temple that day, even though you knew I wasn't dead." Fan Xian's eyes were bright. "You are curious as to who I am and why I clearly do not exist in your memories, but when you look at me, I feel very familiar and close." Fan Xian's eyes were clear and spirited. "You are more curious as to how I avoided your sure-kill strike that day. You are the emissary of the temple. I am a mortal of the world, a target that the temple must eliminate. Why do I understand you so well?" Fan Xian slowly said as he looked at Uncle Wu Zhu's indifferent face. "Of course, please believe me. In this world, no one knows better than me what your greatest curiosity is right now. You are curious as to why you feel a sense of familiarity and closeness. What you are most curious about is why you are curious." 7 consecutive sentences about curiosity spat out from Fan Xian's thin and pale lip. There was not the slightest bit of obstruction or hesitation. Some of them gushed out and pressed forward step by step. Some of them only pointed directly at the cold heart covered by the black cloth. After the 7 sentences, Fan Xian immediately felt exhaustion wash over him. He couldn't resist coughing. After he finished coughing, his eyes grew brighter. The hope in his heart grew stronger. No one knew that when Uncle Wu Zhu's metal rod was so close to the cartilage of his throat, even if he moved a sliver, he would bleed on the spot, much less violently cough. The reason he hadn't died after coughing was because of the metal rod in Wu Zhu's hand. It was precise to an unimaginable degree. As Fan Xian's body trembled and moved, it moved forward and backward. To make a snail's horn in an instant was truly powerful. 13th Wang began to stare closely at Fan Xian's hand. When he realized that he couldn't change anything in front of this strange blind man, he began to watch Fan Xian's body nervously. When Fan Xian coughed, his heart also chilled. Immediately after, he realized that Fan Xian was still alive. This reality made him involuntarily admire Fan Xian to the extreme. He also finally understood where Fan Xian's confidence came from when he ignored his and Haitong's objections under the snowy mountain. But Fan Xian was not nervous at all. Was he not at all worried that he would be killed by this blind man with black cloth in front of him? 13th Wang didn't believe it. He clearly saw that Fan Xian's hands behind his back had been trembling slightly the entire time. 13th Wang took a few steps back toward the stone steps and increased the distance between him and the two of them. He saw Fan Xian's hand gesture and was worried that his existence would disrupt Fan Xian's plans and cause a change to happen to the blind Great Master. Fan Xian's emotions did not completely relax. He stared closely at the black cloth over Uncle Wu Zhu's eyes, trying to see the endless questions in his heart from his expression. A moment later, he found that all of this was futile. Uncle Wu Zhu's face was still indifferent, and the aura between his brows was still unfamiliar. Being always icy could not be considered familiar. In his life, Wu Zhu had only smiled at Fan Xian a few times. However, Wu Zhu's indifference in front of the temple was truly unfamiliar. Fan Xian's heart sank slightly. His body also sank with it. Very naturally, he sat down in the shallow snow in front of the temple door. He did not care at all about the metal drill at his throat, which could kill him at any moment. Miraculously, Wu Zhu also sat down, sitting in front of the temple door. Sitting there alone, it was as if he was blocking all the prying eyes of the world and the howling wind and snow for thousands of years. The metal drill continued to stretch out in Wu Zhu's hand. It was as steady as his forearm, resting on Fan Xian's throat. Perhaps he could hold it like this for 10,000 years and not feel tired. However, Fan Xian felt tired, particularly as Uncle Wu Zhu sat coldly and did not speak. Perhaps there was some warmth in the heart of this icy body, but it still did not warm up. This reality made Fan Xian feel tired. He didn't know if he could wake up this closest family member. In his life, he was most skilled in battles of the mind. His two most outstanding battles were against Haitong and the Emperor. In the end, Haitong had lost to him. Even someone as powerful as the Qing Emperor could not rest easy under the entanglement of Fan Xian's thoughts. Even though father and son had turned against each other, it still left wounds all over the Emperor's heart. Going to the temple again this time to try to wake Uncle Wu Zhu was, without question, a true battle of the mind. However, it was also the most difficult battle of Fan Xian's life. Uncle Wu Zhu was not immortal. From his body to his thoughts, he was not a mortal. He was a legend. He was icy. He was a program. Most importantly, he had forgotten everything. He had forgotten himself and his mother. Wu Zhu sank into an eternally unchanging silence. It brought even more difficulty to Fan Xian's plan. Without conversation, how could he know the changes in the other party's thoughts? How could he take the opportunity to enter and directly strike at the heart? Look at the other party's expression and observe the expression? But what expression had Uncle Wu Zhu ever had in his life? You've been whitewashed. After a long silence, Fan Xian let out a sorrowful sigh. To think that you are a legendary figure in the temple. You are clearly of a higher level than the old man in the temple. How is it that you've been whitewashed? In Fan Xian's view, Uncle Wu Zhu, who had feelings, thoughts, and awareness, had always been a living person. Naturally, he was of a much higher level than the old man in the temple who controlled everything but still only knew how to follow the T4 laws. However, it looked like the temple had a method of controlling the emissaries that went out that no one knew about. Otherwise, Wu Zhu would not have become an inhuman machine. Although Wu Zhu back then was not very human, Fan Xian was not very human. My name is Fan Xian. I told you that day. Although you have forgotten, I want to tell you a story. This story is related to you, and it is also related to me. I hope you can remember something. Of course, even if you remember, perhaps you will not be able to break the chains on your heart. But we have to try. At least you don't want to kill me. This is probably something in your instincts. Isn't that good? Fan Xian followed the perfectly straight metal rod and looked at Uncle Wu Zhu's icy face. He wanted to smile but almost cried. He forcefully took a deep breath and calmed the emotions in his heart. He then began to speak. A long time ago, there was a pretty little girl who lived with you in this temple. Do you still remember? The unmoving metal rod in Wu Zhu's hand moved in and out as Fan Xian took a deep breath. It was very miraculous, but it still stuck to Fan Xian's throat. Just like when Fan Xian's throat moved when he spoke, it also moved with the metal rod. However, this movement was very small, so small that it could not be clearly seen by the naked eye. Fan Xian did not care how much Uncle Wu Zhu remembered. Calmly and sincerely, he continued to narrate the story related to Wu Zhu, the little girl who had helped him escape from the temple. They had gone to Dongyi together. They had met an idiot and done some things. Then, they had gone to Danzhou. They had met a group of idiots and a eunuch idiot. Then, everything else, the snow in the sky slowly floated down. It brought an indescribable feeling of holiness and solemnity to the surroundings of the temple. Perhaps the old man in the temple was using a silent method to endlessly urge Wu Zhu to move. Fan Xian sometimes coughed and sometimes was silent. His unusually raspy and tired voice seemed to be the complete opposite of an order. It had Wu Zhu maintain his current posture and sit motionlessly by the door of the temple. Gradually, the white snow covered their bodies. Wu Zhu was clearly closer to the eaves of the temple, but more snow had accumulated on his body. Perhaps it was because his body temperature was relatively low. The weather grew colder and colder. The snow on Fan Xian's body melted and flowed down along his leather jacket. The coldness seeped into his body and made him cough more frequently. However, his words did not stop at all. He continued to narrate the past, everything about Wu Zhu's past. The scene on that carriage seems to be rewinding. Fan Xian coughed and used the corner of his sleeve to wipe away his snot, which had already turned to ice. Although he was wretched, the light in his eyes did not dim at all. He knew that this battle of the heart was a battle against the temple's control over Uncle Wu Zhu. He did not have any room to relax. In Danzhou, you opened a general store, but business was not very good. It was often closed. Your face was always icy, so of course, no one was willing to look after your business. Fan Xian smiled sourly and continued in a raspy voice. Of course, I was willing to look after your business. Although I was still young at the time, you often prepared some good wine for me to drink. As he spoke, Fan Xian seemed to have returned to his childhood after his rebirth. At that time, life in Danzhou was somewhat dull and tedious. His grandmother treated him strictly but kindly and refused to slack off in her studies. Furthermore, the people of Danzhou did not give him the opportunity to kill in all directions. He could only desperately practice the tyrannical martial method, follow Sir Fei everywhere to dig up corpses, and work hard to memorize the Overwatch Council's regulations and execution rules. He also had to prevent assassination attempts. However, those were, after all, the happiest days of Fan Xian's 2 lives. It was not only because of Danzhou's refreshing sea breeze and the beautiful camellias covering the mountain. It was also not because of Dong Er's gentleness or the 4 serving girls' loveliness. The biggest reason was because of that general store, that icy blind young servant, the yellow flowers on the precipice, and the education under the stick. As Fan Xian spoke, he was somewhat lost in thought. He thought of when he went to the general store to steal wine to drink as a child. Uncle Wu Zhu would always shred radishes for him to drink without caring how old he was. Involuntarily, a glimmer of warmth rose to the corners of his lips. Like a magic trick, Fan Xian took out a radish from his swollen leather jacket and then a kitchen knife. He began to chop and chop at the green stone ground in front of the temple, cutting the radish. The green stone ground in front of the temple had experienced thousands of years of wind, frost, and snow, but it was still smooth. Using it as a chopping board, although it was a bit stiff, it had a certain crispness. The knife moved like it was flying. In just a moment, a frozen and crisp radish was cut into shreds of uniform thickness and placed neatly on the green stone ground. While cutting the radish, Fan Xian didn't speak. Wu Zhu tilted his head and looked calmly at the knife and radish in Fan Xian's hand through the black cloth. It seemed that he didn't understand what was happening in front of him. Cutting radish shreds in front of the temple, if Fan Xian could survive, presumably would be the most arrogant thing he had ever done in his life. It was more arrogant than jumping off the palace walls to kill Qin Yi, more arrogant than charging into the royal palace to slap the Empress Dowager, and even more arrogant than entering the palace with a single sword to assassinate the emperor. However, Wu Zhu still didn't seem to remember anything. He was just curious about Fan Xian's senseless action. Fan Xian lowered his head and sighed. He threw the kitchen knife to the side and pointed at the radish shreds in front of him. In a light voice, he said, "Back then, you always complained that my radish shreds weren't cut well. What do you think of my cutting now?" Wu Zhu straightened his head and remained cold and silent. A thick coldness grew in Fan Xian's heart. He suddenly felt that he was doing useless work. No matter what he did, it was impossible to wake Uncle Wu Zhu. Uncle Wu Zhu was already dead and would never come back to life again. The world was very cold. The temple was very cold. However, Fan Xian seemed to have only just felt it. His entire body shivered. He suddenly gritted his teeth with all his strength. He bit down until a trail of blood seeped out from the corner of his lips. He stared fixedly at Wu Zhu angrily. It was a long time before his emotions calmed down. In a dark voice he said, "I don't believe this. Don't pretend. I know you remember. I know you remember." Fan Xian's voice was extremely raspy. The continuous talking had hurt his vocal cords. "I don't believe you've forgotten the many years we spent together on the cliff. I don't believe you've forgotten. That night, when we were talking about the chest and mother, you smiled. Have you forgotten? What about that rainy night? You tricked Hong Xiang out of the palace. Later, you bragged to me that you could kill him. We stole the key back and opened the chest. Then you smiled again." Fan Xian coughed violently and scolded, "You clearly know how to smile. Why are you pretending to be dead?" Wu Zhu still did not move. The metal drill in his hand also did not move as it pierced Fan Xian's throat. The snow continued to fall coldly. In front of the temple, other than Fan Xian's voice, there was no other movement. Gradually, the sky darkened slightly. Perhaps it was already night, or perhaps it was just the clouds thickening. However, the snow above Fan Xian's head stopped. A rustling sound rang out. 13th Wang's head was covered in sweat. He set up a small spare tent behind Fan Xian and then pushed it over Fan Xian's head, covering his entire body. Coincidentally, the tent's door was between Fan Xian and Wu Zhu, so he did not move the stable metal drill. The snow was heavy. 13th Wang was worried about Fan Xian's health, so he had gone through a lot of trouble earlier and rushed back to the camp as quickly as possible. He had brought a small tent to help Fan Xian block the snow. No wonder he was panting so heavily. Perhaps Fan Xian knew, or perhaps he didn't. He only stared unblinkingly at Wu Zhu with his absent-minded or lifeless eyes. In an unpleasant and raspy voice, he spoke with all his might. Fan Xian was not a chatterbox. The words he said that day were probably more than he had in his entire life. After 13th Wang finished all this, He glanced at the two strange people at the door of the temple with a complicated expression. He once again sat down on the stone steps covered in snow. Only 3 idiots could do such an idiotic thing. A day and a night passed. The metal drill in Wu Zhu's hand didn't leave Fan Xian's throat for a day and a night. It seemed that even he didn't know why he didn't want to kill this talkative mortal in front of him. Fan Xian spoke non-stop for a day and a night. It seemed that even he didn't know that his saliva had long dried up. The food and water that 13th Wang had brought had all been put aside by him. His saliva dried up and regrown. After his vocal cords were damaged, they were extremely raspy. In the end, the spittle he brought had even been dyed pink. His throat began to bleed. His voice began to become so ugly that it was difficult to hear what he meant. His speaking speed was already slower than that of an old man with 1 foot in the grave. 13th Wang listened beside this pair of strange people for a day and a night. He began to listen very seriously. In Fan Xian's bloody and tearful complaints to Wu Zhu, he heard much of the truth of the turbulent times in the land. He learned of many magnificent figures. He also learned of Fan Xian's childhood and life as a youth. When Fan Xian began to repeat his life biography for the 3rd time and took out a kitchen knife for the 4th time to mimic the action of slicing radishes, hoping that Wu Zhu would remember something, 13th Wang couldn't bear to listen anymore. He hugged his knees and sat by the stone step. Looking at the strange and beautiful shadows in the distance on the snowy mountain range, his fingers unconsciously gathered the ashes and traces of ashes by his side. It was Sigujian's remains. When Haitang walked to the door of the temple, this was the scene she saw. She saw 3 idiot-like people. 13th Wang was sitting on the stone steps in a daze, playing with his teacher's ashes. Fan Xian was sitting like a little statue of a village god in the doorway of a small tent. He continued to speak in a raspy and unpleasant voice, as vague and difficult to understand content that was like a heavenly book. Wu Zhu extended the metal drill and didn't move at all. He was very much like a statue. This statue was covered from head to toe in snow and didn't have a glimmer of life. The metal drill lay between Wu Zhu and Fan Xian. It was as if it separated 2 completely different, untouchable worlds. Regardless of whether it was thrust out or pulled back, perhaps everyone present would feel much better. Yet, it was this coldness and stability that lay between the 2 of them. It made one feel endless sorrow and pain. One person couldn't bear to leave, but the person who couldn't bear to leave still didn't understand. The most painful thing in the world was nothing more than not understanding. With just one glance, Haitang knew what had happened during this day and night. A bitterness that was difficult to suppress rose in her heart. It was not until now that she was certain that, for Fan Xian, there were always many things that were more important than his life. He's gone mad. Haitang looked in a daze at the clearly inauspicious red flush on Fan Xian's face. She listened to his raspy, slow, and indistinct voice. She looked at the specks of blood-colored saliva on the snow on Wu Zhu's body. Her heart felt a stabbing pain. 13th Wang stood with unusual difficulty. Looking at her in silence for a moment, he said, "You've gone mad. Otherwise, why wouldn't you listen to him and come up?" "I just felt that since he was going to die, I also wanted to see him die." Haitang glanced at 13th Wang and said with her head slightly lowered, "He won't be able to hold out for long. His injury has never healed. That day, he was stabbed through and lost too much blood. Even if he wanted to pass through the icy plains and return south, it would be a difficult task. Furthermore, he doesn't care for his life and insisted on trying." 13th Wang turned around and stood side by side with Haitang. He looked at Fan Xian, who seemed to know nothing and feel nothing, and continued to try to wake Wu Zhu. Calmly, he said, "He's been talking for an entire day and night and has been frozen for an entire day and night. If he continues like this, there is only death. Can you persuade him to leave?" It looks like the blind great master didn't listen to the order of the immortals in the temple to kill him. It would be better if you killed him. Then you wouldn't have to be like me last night, hearing his hopeless voice the entire time. 13th Wang suddenly smiled and said, however, I truly admire Fan Xian. It is very rare to see someone so ruthless to himself. Haiteng looked at Fan Xian's pale, flushed, and exhausted face. She looked at it for a long time. Suddenly, her body trembled slightly. A glimmer of light rose in her eyes that was brighter than the mountain range and valley. 13th Wang suddenly felt a ripple beside him. He stared at Haiteng with wide eyes. A mouthful of fresh blood sprayed out and struck the black cloth close to him. It then flowed down the icy snow on that icy face. It appeared particularly ghastly. However, Wu Zhu still did not move. With unusual difficulty, Fan Xian wiped away the blood at the corner of his lip. He knew that he was at the end of his rope. A hopeless feeling rose in his heart. The family in front of him was still unfamiliar, still cold, still soulless, still dead. Fan Xian couldn't help but shiver again. He suddenly remembered that Uncle Wu Zhu had always been responsible for spreading the fire seed for the temple and had walked the world for tens of thousands of years. He probably had hundreds of thousands of years' worth of memories in his mind. Perhaps, the unforgettable memories he had coughed up blood and repeated this day and night were only common existences for the body in front of him that was as cold as a snowy mountain. It was the same for his mother, Yi Qingmei's memories. It was as if he could use these common stories to awaken a person with countless experiences and memories. What a childish and absurd idea. Thinking of this, all of Fan Xian's hopes turned to dust. A sense of hopelessness rose in his eyes. His voice was slightly twisted. It appeared particularly distressed and unclear. He roared in a raspy voice at the eternally unmoving Uncle Wu Zhu in front of him. How could you forget me? Are you addicted to amnesia? Last time, you at least remembered Yi Qingmei. How could you forget even me this time? The metal drill was close at hand, still at the vital point of his throat. Fan Xian's entire body trembled. His body was stiff. He sank into a death-like silence because he had already lost his voice. He could no longer say anything. His body trembled more and more violently. The hopelessness in his eyes had long transformed into the flames of madness and anger. He stared fixedly at the black cloth on Wu Zhu's face. A sinister and vicious expression suddenly flashed across his face. He leaped toward the other party. Fan Xian's body had long been frozen. Although he had leaped, in reality, he was falling straight toward Wu Zhu's position. His throat crashed into the metal drill. The tip of the metal drill retreated swiftly, but Fan Xian still fell down. He fell down heavily. Thus, the metal drill in Wu Zhu's hand could only retreat further. When there was nowhere else to retreat, he could only let go, allowing Fan Xian, who had been frozen like a popsicle, to fall in front of him. Fan Xian extended a hand and viciously grabbed a corner of Wu Zhu's clothes. Snow rustled and fell down. He stared into Wu Zhu's eyes. Although he could not speak, the vicious and self-confident look in his eyes declared one thing. You don't want to kill me. You don't want to kill me. You can't kill me. Although you don't know who I am, your instincts, your heart, have me. Come with me. Fan Xian, who had been unable to speak, suddenly became spirited. He let go of the metal drill and lowered his head in thought. His desperate leap had finally pushed the metal drill between him and Wu Zhu away. The distance between the two worlds could not be any closer. It was at this moment that Fan Xian made his request. Wu Zhu was silent for a long time. His face was still expressionless. I don't know who you are. When you don't know anything, just follow your heart. What is the heart? Feelings. Feelings are only a method humans use to deceive themselves and numb themselves. In the end, they can only deceive for a while. Life has always been a moment plus a moment. If you can deceive for a while, you can deceive for a lifetime. If you can deceive for a lifetime, how can it be considered deceiving? But I still don't know who you are. I also don't know who I am. You don't need to know who I am. If you want to know who you are, you have to come with me. I know you are curious. Curiosity is a feeling that only humans have. You are human. Only humans want to know what is on the other side of the mountain, what is on the other side of the sea, what are the stars, what is the sun. What is on the other side of the mountain? You have to see for yourself. Since you want to know what is outside the temple, you have to come with me. Why is this conversation so familiar? But I still don't quite understand it. Do not be at a loss. Flash like lightning and let out a thunderbolt from your eyes. Do what you think. If you can't figure it out, follow your heart and leave this temple where even birds don't shit. But the temple, these conversations did not actually happen. At least, Wu Zhu and Fan Xian, who was lying in the snow, did not have such a conversation. After Fan Xian said those 3 words, the two of them only looked at each other in silence. Then Wu Zhu, with great difficulty, bent his body and picked up Fan Xian. He then placed him on his back. It was just like the blind young servant carrying the infant many years ago. Fan Xian felt the icy cold back in front of him, but he felt it was unusually warm. The expression on his face was indifferent because the emotions in his heart could not be expressed with any expression. He wanted to cry, but he also wanted to laugh. He knew that Uncle Wu Zhu still did not remember anything, but he knew that Uncle Wu Zhu was willing to leave this broken temple with him. Thus, he wanted to cry out happily, but he could not. He wanted to cry out loud, but he was so cold that he curled up into a ball. He could only cough furiously, endlessly coughing up blood. Then, Fan Xian saw Haitang and 13th Wang, the 2 most powerful young warriors in the world. At this moment, their faces were pale and their eyes were dim. It was as if they had just experienced the most terrifying thing in the world. What was most frightening was that both of them were trembling all over. It was as if they were about to lose control of the terror in their hearts. What had happened to make Haitang and 13th Wang like this? 13th Wang looked at the scene in front of him and knew that Fan Xian had won. However, there did not seem to be a glimmer of happiness on his face. There was only lingering fear and a glimmer of faint regret. His entire body trembled like the second disciple of Wu Zhu. Gazing at Fan Xian, he said in a dry voice, "We destroyed the temple." The title of the chapter is from an old book, The Most Powerful, My Name. If you have time, you can read it. Chapter 758. I have an important dinner tonight and cannot push it off. I have written less today. I saluted with my hands. Smashed the temple. Hearing these words come out of 13th Wang's trembling voice, Fan Xian couldn't help but shiver on Wu Zhu's back. He looked at his 2 companions not far in front of him and couldn't say anything. He knew 13th Wang was speaking the truth, because Haitang and 13th Wang's pale faces and unusually complicated gaze revealed everything. There were not many things in this world that could make these 2 so frightened. Fan Xian coughed violently and couldn't make a sound. He only felt his scalp go numb. Strand by strand of hair were like needles stabbing into his skull. He felt a wave of pain and fear that was difficult to suppress. He was not afraid that after the temple was smashed, the old man formed from specks of light would immediately use a weapon of mass destruction to kill him. It was just the ruins of a broken temple with a guide. If it was smashed, then it was smashed. What was he afraid of? He was worried about the person in front of him. He was worried that after Wu Zhu heard the news of the temple being smashed, he would remember his duty as a temple guard. In an instant, Fan Xian changed his mind. When the temple was smashed, Uncle Wu Zhu must have known what was happening inside. He hadn't moved earlier. He couldn't possibly move now, could he? He had extravagant hopes in his heart because right now, his body and spirit were both extremely weak. He could no longer fiercely respond. He had spent an entire day and night, and in the end, he had risked his life to move the icy heart under the black cloth and persuade Wu Zhu to leave with him. If anything happened now, he might even have the heart to die. Fan Xian would not blame Haitang and 13th Wang. He knew that his two companions saw that he was about to die and couldn't bear to watch. That was why they had made such an unusually daring move. Perhaps it was because the temple had been smashed that Uncle Wu Zhu had one less spiritual shackle and had become a living person from a statue. Thinking of this, he felt even more gratitude toward Haitang and 13th Wang. He knew that these two did not have the knowledge and experience of his previous life. In their hearts, particularly in Haitang's heart, she had spent her entire life serving the temple. At this moment, she had smashed the temple for him. A number of thoughts flashed through Fan Xian's mind like flowing light. He nervously watched Uncle Wu Zhu's thin and steady shoulders in front of him. Wu Zhu did not move. When Fan Xian coughed up blood in an attempt to wake Wu Zhu, Haitang and 13th Wang floated in through the slightly ajar door of the temple. At that time, Fan Xian's entire attention was focused on Wu Zhu in front of him and did not notice at all. Wu Zhu also seemed to have ignored him due to some fluctuating emotions. Thus, Haitang and 13th Wang went in and smashed. After they were done, they came out like thugs who had confiscated property. However, their bodies were still trembling. The paleness of their faces had not improved at all. They had never thought that in this lifetime they would not only be able to come to the temple to worship, but they would also be able to smash the things in the temple into a mess. In the eyes of the people of the world, the status of the temple was lofty and illusory. Furthermore, a few days ago, they had personally seen the immortal floating in midair. They were not like Fan Xian, who dared to be disrespectful to an existence that completely exceeded human imagination. They also did not have the extravagant hope that they could defeat the immortal. Thus, when they entered the temple, they held on to the belief that they would die. They only wanted to disturb the spirits of the immortals in the temple and have Fan Xian find an opportunity to save the blind great master. Who would have thought that they would so easily destroy the temple? The immortal was frozen in the air. Haitang and 13th Wang thought they were blind and didn't look at him because they didn't dare to. The immortal's voice rang out beside their ears. They thought they were deaf and didn't listen at all because they didn't dare to. Trembling like this, they thought they were going to die. They went in and smashed randomly. In the end, the immortal disappeared just like that. The most wondrous and inconceivable thing in the world was this. As Haitang and 13th Wang stood trembling outside the temple door, they still didn't dare to believe what they had experienced in the temple earlier. Uncle Wu Zhu did not move. Fan Xian relaxed slightly and looked stupidly at his two stupefied companions in front of him. He thought to himself that the ways of the world were truly difficult to explain. A moment later, he used his saliva to moisten his throat. Feeling that he could open his mouth to speak, he said in a raspy voice, "You are very powerful." Cold snow floated down on the desolate snowy plains. The sky was so gray that it was impossible to tell whether it was day or night. Only the endless wind and snow swirled and moved between the icy plains and snowy hills, blocking out most of the light. Amidst the deathly silence, the occasional not very loud barking of a dog could be heard, startling the thousands and tens of thousands of years of silence in the snowy plains of the extreme north. A few sledges were moving with difficulty toward the south in the wind and snow. On the sledge at the very front stood a young man holding a wooden stick. Facing the wind and snow, he narrowed his eyes and looked in that direction. The second sledge was arranged particularly tightly. In front of it was a snow canopy that blocked out the wind and snow. On the sledge, a pale-faced young man was half lying in the arms of a girl. However, the girl was wearing a fur coat, so it was impossible to see her figure. At the back of the sledge procession was a youth wearing cotton clothing. His eyes were covered with a black cloth. He followed at a moderate distance. Pulled by the snow hounds, the sledges moved quickly. However, this blind youth took steady step. He did not appear fast, but in reality, he was not pulled down at all. Fan Xian gently turned his neck and turned his head to glance at the back of the procession, at Uncle Wu Zhu, who was walking step by step in the ice and snow. A faint sorrow and disappointment rose in his eyes. However, he didn't say anything. He closed his eyes again and began to use the yuanqi in the wind and snow to heal the injuries in his body. Most of the dozens of snow hounds had died on this difficult journey. Only 11, led by Ada and Aer, remained. These snow hounds had probably never been to such a northern and cold place in their lives. Their animal instincts made them fearful and uneasy. That was why, under 13th Wang's suppression, they still couldn't stop themselves from barking a few times at the gray sky. Fortunately, this was the second time they had been on this path. Otherwise, who knew if these snow hounds would be scared stiff by the unmelting ice and snow and the lifeless world. After coming down from the snowy mountain, Wu Zhu still maintained his coldness and silence. He only followed Fan Xian's procession from a distance and didn't open his mouth to say anything. He still didn't remember anything. Perhaps it should be said that he didn't know anything. He was just an icy shell. Yet, because of a speck of light in his soul, he descended the snowy mountain, left the temple, and began to follow the sledge procession south, if Wu Zhu had a soul. Thus, Fan Xian was sad and disappointed. He didn't know how long this situation would last. He didn't know if Uncle Wu Zhu would wake up. If he truly couldn't wake up, this Wu Zhu would still not be the Wu Zhu he was. A snowflake was picked up by the wind and floated into the sleigh in a strange curve, covering Fan Xian's eyes. Haitang was slightly startled. She was about to use her finger to brush the snowflake away when unexpectedly, Fan Xian opened his eyes and looked at her with a slight smile. There was an indescribable feeling in the warmth of his smile. Haitang avoided his gaze and looked at 13th Wang standing in the snow in front of her. Her face blushed faintly. It had been a number of years since the two of them had first met. She rarely showed such a girlish side in front of Fan Xian. However, this time, they had gone deep into the snowy plains of the extreme north, visited the temple, and experienced things that mortals had never experienced in countless lifetimes. Haitang Duoduo's heart was no longer the same as before. Fan Xian saw her avoid his gaze, but his smile did not fade. On the contrary, he felt warmth in his heart. The matter of the temple being smashed had the greatest impact on his emotions. He knew that at the time, Haitang and 13th Wang had gone with the intent to die. Most importantly, the two of them had to suppress their innate reverence and fear toward the temple. This kind of friendship was rare in the world. His eyes narrowed slightly. His gaze pierced through the wind and snow and landed on the snowy mountain far behind him. Logically speaking, the snowy mountain should have long disappeared from sight. However, he always felt that the snowy mountain was there and the temple was there. The day before, in the snowy mountain, Fan Xian had entered the temple again in the end. He also saw the messy state of the temple. His emotions were unusually complicated. There was also a faint sense of sorrow and pity. After all, it was the last remnant of his world. If it was truly destroyed in his hands, fortunately, as Fan Xian had expected, the spots of light condensed again. The gentle but actually emotionless old man of the temple appeared again. Perhaps the temple had already determined that the first and last emissary in the temple had already broken free of control, so it did not say anything about clearing out the target again. Even Fan Xian had not found the center of the temple or the last military museum. Haitang and 13th Wang had probably only destroyed a few ancillary facilities. In the temple, Fan Xian and the elder had a final conversation. As for what they talked about, only Fan Xian knew. After this conversation, Fan Xian resolutely left the temple and left the old man alone in the snowy mountain. I'll leave you for a lifetime and wait for the temple to regenerate itself. You'll be able to survive and die alone. This was Fan Xian's revenge against the temple. He believed that in such a world of ice and snow, and without the support of resources, the temple could not cause any trouble. If it truly had such power, it would not have watched as the emissaries in the temple died one by one without being able to do anything about it. Besides, there was still Wu Zhu in the world. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.